Chapter 584. Black blood sprayed onto the purple grapes and dripped down to the ground, wetting the floor illuminated by the lantern light. The second prince lowered his head and opened his mouth. There was a patch of blood on his lower jaw. His eyes were lowered. Without looking at Fan Xian, he raised his hand and stopped him from walking over. The moment you entered the manor, I took the medicine. The second prince crouched on the chair with his head very low. Faintly he said, I know you are Fei Jie's student, but the poison has already entered my heart. You can't save me. I also don't want you to save me. You have to know that although you are powerful, you can't stop me from dying. As long as a person had the will to die, no matter what method was used, it was impossible to save his life. Fan Xian understood this. He looked at the other person calmly. His heart was empty and had no thoughts. However, he was still not prepared to watch with folded arms. It was not because he had a glimmer of brotherly affection for the second prince. Rather, he could not let the other person die in front of him. Don't worry about anything. I have already written my will earlier. The palace will not blame you. No one will think you killed me. The second prince lowered his head. His blood-stained hand fumbled in his clothes and pulled out a letter. Gently he placed it on the table. Unexpectedly, before he died, he had even thought of what Fan Xian was worried about. Fan Xian's heart froze slightly. He knew that the other person was as Linger said. He was ruthless toward himself to a certain realm and had cut off any hope of survival. The second prince raised his head and glanced at Fan Xian with an envious gaze. He then vomited up another mouthful of black blood. He used his sleeve to carelessly wipe his lips. Using two slender fingers, he carefully broke off the grapes stained by the poisonous blood. Leaving behind a small, clean half, he sent it back into his mouth. The sweet and juicy grapes were chewed into mush in his mouth. The second prince spat out the grape seeds. He spat them onto the ground, still carrying black blood. After eating the grapes, he wiped his hands clean on his body and sighed. Looking at Fan Xian, who had been silent and not moving, he faintly said, I don't want to continue living as a joke. Fan Xian nodded to indicate that he understood his thoughts. Actually, you are also a joke. A layer of deathly gray gradually rose to the second prince's face. His gaze was slightly unfocused. Thinking of something, he said, There are a lot of people in Jingdo who want to kill you. Yes, the first person to act was me, but do you think Qingqian has been gentle toward you? The Qin family didn't kill you in the valley. He was so angry he jumped all night in the Eastern Palace, but why? He stared into Fan Xian's eyes. Why is it that your attitude toward Qingqian is completely different from how you treat me? Fan Xian himself did not understand this point. The second prince was about to die and his words were also straightforward. They pierced straight into his heart. Why was it that he had always been so tolerant and gentle toward the crown prince, but pestered the second prince relentlessly and spared no expense? The second prince's eyelids drooped weakly, and his voice was extremely low. You don't like me. You didn't like me from the beginning. Of course, I don't like you either. The two of us are too similar. It's just that I've never had such good luck as you. No matter who it is, no one will allow another to exist in the world. Everyone will unconsciously try to get rid of the other first. His gaze was cold and helpless. If you are Prince Jia of the Ronghua Manor, then I can only be Zhen Baoyu of Jinling. I will never get many chances to appear in the novel, but I am the real one. I am the real one. As the second prince spoke, he coughed up blood. The blood was smeared all over the front of his clothes. He appeared very wretched. Fan Xian looked at the scene in front of him. His body was stiff and he couldn't make any reaction. The second prince raised his head for the last time and stared at Fan Xian's face. With some difficulty he said, I always thought Qingqian was the most cowardly of all the brothers. Only when I was about to die did I realize that I was also very cowardly. I would rather die and humbly leave Ling and mother than have the courage to face. After I die, help me take care of Ling. As for mother, her best ending is probably to be banished into the cold palace. Please help me take care of her. The second prince's chest rose and fell violently as if something was about to charge out. He stared into Fan Xian's eyes and forced himself to finish speaking. He didn't give Fan Xian any chance to speak. Opening his mouth, he spat out a large pool of black blood and stopped breathing. After death, the second prince continued to crouch on the chair with his left hand on his knee. His handsome face carried a deathly ashen color. A moment later, his body fell off the chair with a thud. However, his eyes refused to close and were wide open. Fan Xian looked at the second prince's body with a numb expression. He suddenly felt that this early autumn night could be so cold. He shivered. His emotions were complicated. He didn't know what kind of sigh he should make about the body in front of him. Perhaps silence was the best attitude. The second prince, the true prince, was already dead. How could the fake soul in his body continue? His expression was not very good. It was not because the second prince had committed suicide in front of him, nor was it because of the heart-wrenching words the second prince had said before he died. Rather, in the end, the second prince had asked him to help him take care of Ling Er and Lady Shu. He didn't even give him a chance to refuse? Fan Xian thought to himself. His expression was desolate. When the eldest princess died, she gave Wan Er to him. The crown prince knew that he was going to die, so he entrusted the families of the rebel soldiers and officials to him. What? Don't you know that I am your irreconcilable enemy? Was your death not caused by me? Why do you throw so many burdens at me before you die? Do you want to crush me to death? Are you betting that I will help you? You dead people. If you die, then die. Why do you want me, a living person, to live so uncomfortably? He lowered his head and was incomparably wooden. His body trembled slightly. He then walked to the side of the second prince's body and glanced at it. He picked up the thin will from the table and put it into his clothes. Then he walked out of the sinister room. Walking to the bedroom in the back garden of the manor, Yi Ling Er was still sitting woodenly under the cold light of the green lantern. She had no idea what had happened in the back garden. Fan Xian sighed in his heart and walked directly behind her. Striking down with his palm, he didn't give her any chance to react before knocking her out. If he didn't knock her out, once she learned of the second prince's suicide by poison, she would probably follow him. Fan Xian could only use this more direct method to delay the matter. Gong Dian came forward to greet him. Fan Xian lowered his head and thought for a moment. He then handed the will in his clothes to him. At the same time, he handed Yi Ling Er, who was on his shoulder, to him and said something in a low voice. Gong Dian accepted the unconscious Yi Ling Er. He was already very shocked. Hearing the news of the second prince's death, he furrowed his brows tightly. The second prince wrote a will. The emperor won't blame you or me. Fan Xian sighed. Immediately after, he said seriously, before Wang Fei wakes up, first tie up her hands and feet. Then tell her this news. If she doesn't want to eat, force rice soup down my throat. No matter what, she has to drink it. These last two sentences had already been roared out through gritted teeth. They were incomparably sinister. Gong Dian thought that this was indeed the only way. He didn't notice the Duke of Dambua's loss of composure. After thinking for a moment, he helplessly said, "But the young lady's personality is like a raging fire. We can't tie her up for the rest of her life. Fire is not scary. Comes quickly and goes quickly. It's not as piercing as a lump of ice like me and the second prince," Fan Xian thought to himself. Lowering his voice, he said, "After a few days, when things have calmed down a bit, I'll come and try to persuade her." After he finished dealing with the matters of the manor, the night in Jingdo had gradually receded. It was already early in the morning. In the distant east, a faint sliver of white peeked out. However, Fan Xian had no way of resting. He still had too many things to do. After circling back to the Fan Manor from the manor, he went directly to the royal palace. Although Minister Fan had said that these matters should be handled by the Board of Rites Taichung Temple, Fan Xian could not forget his identity as regent and pretend these things had never happened. Furthermore, he was also the vice minister of Taichung Temple, Minister Rin Xiao, and had followed the emperor to Dong Mountain to worship heaven. He didn't know if he would survive. He and the great prince stood side by side. Looking at the three black coffins in front of them, the two brothers were silent. Just a day ago, the two of them had been standing on the palace walls worrying about the safety of the palace and the world of the Qin kingdom. Who would have thought that at this moment, victory and defeat had already been decided? The people who wrote the history of the world had already changed their names. Who would have thought that at the moment of danger in the royal palace, the black coffins under Fan Xian's feet had already begun to contain the skin of the defeated? The eldest princess and the second prince were lying quietly in the coffins. There was another coffin that was empty. No one knew who was going to lie in it next. This is not in accordance with etiquette. The great prince's expression was heavy. He struggled not to show sorrow between his brows. The eldest princess was one thing, but the brotherly affection between him and the second prince, Li Qingze, could not be faked. Although the two brothers had gradually drifted apart during these 2 years, looking at the scene in front of him and thinking of the people in the coffins, the great prince's heart still ached. Fan Xian nodded his head tiredly and said, "The officials of the Board of Rites have all been scared away. It looks like as long as the emperor doesn't return to the capital, the 6 ministries will not be able to be gathered together. There aren't many people in Taichung Temple either. They are just temporary accommodations. After all, the face of the royal family has to be taken care of. They can't just stay in the manor. The great prince sighed and didn't say anything more. He turned and walked into the royal palace. Compared to the group of imperial soldiers escorting the coffins, his figure appeared very desolate. Fan Xian looked at him calmly and shook his head. He knew that in the face of the repeated heavy pressure and the gradually arriving news of death, the great prince was almost unable to hold out. Thinking of this, only then did Fan Xian feel waves of exhaustion coming from the depths of his body. He could barely keep his eyelids open. Furrowing his brows, he slapped his face and said to the subordinate beside him, "Return to the manor." In one night he had returned to the manor 4 times, but there was not a moment of peace. Fan Xian thought about it carefully. From the beginning of the preparations before breaking into the palace, he had not slept for 2 days and 2 nights. His injuries had already relapsed. The power of the ephedra pill had completely worn off. He didn't dare take it again. His entire body's energy and strength had indeed reached their limits. After returning to the manor, Fan Xian looked at everything in the dark night. He didn't go to see Wanner, who was staying in Lady Lu's room. He lowered his head and sat silently on the bed for a while. He then kicked the black chest under the bed. Without even taking off his clothes, he lay down with his arms spread out. He was clearly exhausted, yet he couldn't sleep. He opened his bright eyes and looked at the dark ceiling. He didn't sleep for long before he woke up. After all, Jingdo was still in chaos. As the regent, he could not give himself too much time to rest and be sad. After getting out of bed, he randomly ate something and used a hot towel to soak his face, forcefully recovering his energy. As he walked out the door, he unconsciously glanced down at the bed. That fatal chest, the chest that often stayed in the dust, lay quietly under the bed. It was like the eldest princess and second prince lying quietly in their coffins. No one would ever disturb them again. Regardless of whether it was a chest or a person, perhaps only by becoming an unremarkable existence and placed in an unremarkable place could they obtain true peace. As he left the manor, he unconsciously glanced back inside. After returning from Taiping courtyard, he still hadn't seen Wanhe. He didn't know what his wife's mood was. Thinking of this, a glimmer of darkness rose to his face. As he entered the palace, he unconsciously glanced toward the palace doors. There were fire and smoke marks everywhere on the red palace doors. Some of the cracks caused by weapons were gaping open, revealing the wood shavings inside. The copper nails that had been knocked off had long been cleaned up. There were only countless ugly scars left on the doors. In this instant, Fan Xian confirmed some things. This palace, this city, and this country were, after all, the place he had lived for 20 years. He had already developed deep feelings for this place. Even though this palace was cold and gloomy, even though this city had let down many people, and even though this country had made a great mistake, it was still his country. He had always thought of himself as a Qing person. There were many things that he had not investigated clearly. Before he understood them, he didn't mind doing his best to maintain the peace of the people in this country while he lived a beautiful life, just as he had done all these years. So many people had died, so he had to live well. Unless some people didn't want him to live. He invited the scholars Hu and Shu back to their manors to temporarily rest. These 2 officials had already been in the royal study drafting up the imperial edicts for an entire night. Some of the important memorials to the Qing kingdom had finally been roughly sorted out. However, the 2 scholars were not made of iron. Their mental state was much worse than Fan Xian's. After receiving a series of shocks and not sleeping, they were long exhausted. Fan Xian sat in the empty royal study and couldn't help but shake his head. Usually, when the emperor was here, although the royal study was just as quiet, it was always filled with a different feeling. Was it dignity? Or something else? In any case, it was completely different from the royal study he sensed. He didn't know how the emperor had come down from Dong Mountain alive, but he knew that his performance would certainly satisfy the emperor. It looked like his position as a powerful official could be secured. However, when he thought of the war that would open the curtains in 2 or 3 years, Fan Xian felt a bit of bitterness in his mouth. It was said that a gentleman did not bully a darkroom. However, Fan Xian was not a gentleman. He sat alone in the royal study looking at the mountainous piles of memorials on the low platform and the soft couch. He thought of how the emperor had been controlling the entire Qing kingdom's court politics from there. His heart jumped. He stood up and looked calmly in that direction. Slightly tilting his head, he wondered what it would feel like if he sat there. Immediately after, he shook his head. His thin lips twitched slightly, revealing a glimmer of self-mockery. Being regent for a day and night had almost tired him out like a big yellow dog in the summer. Looking at the wretched appearance of the scholars who ensue being supported by the eunuchs, Fan Xian confirmed that the emperor's job was certainly more tiring than that of the Yellow Emperor, who had countless women every day. It was still that old saying. There were only three kinds of people in the world: men, women, and the emperor. Anyone who could be a true ruler was not a person. Invite the third prince over. Fan Xian smiled slightly and spoke to the little eunuch outside the royal study. He immediately thought of Hongzhu and some of the people involved in the rebellion who were still imprisoned in the cold palace. He didn't know how the emperor would handle this matter after he returned. However, in the eyes of an outsider, Hongzhu had basically done nothing, so there shouldn't be any major problems. In just a few years, the third prince, Li Qingping, who had gradually grown into a youthful appearance, arrived outside the royal study accompanied by an old nanny and a few eunuchs. Fan Xian glanced at the old nanny and waved his hand for them to leave. Holding the third prince's hand, he came to the front of the desk where the memorials were kept. Li Qingping's hand was slightly cold. The gaze with which he looked at Fan Xian was also different from when he was in Jiangnan. It appeared to be somewhat respectful. Fan Xian had already noticed this scene out of the corner of his eye, but he did not care much. He was respectful and fearful, but there was no sense of alienation. He knew that his performance this day and night had left a deep impression on this brother of his. He would probably never be able to shake off this kind of mark. This was a problem in education. Other than Fan Xian, no one in this world understood it. In order to raise a prince who dared to open a brothel and kill people at the age of 9 into a kind ruler, pure moral teachings were not enough to complete the task. He had to let the third prince understand that there were many things in this world that could be achieved through more open and above-board methods. The third prince needed a role model. From the beginning of the Jiangnan trip, Fan Xian had set himself as the role model in the third prince's heart because he was an immortal poet, a warrior, a powerful official, and the savior of the third prince. In the hearts of most of the people of Qin Kingdom, he was a good person. Fan Xian hoped that the future emperor of Qin Kingdom would also be a good person, just like the crown prince. Sir, I heard father. Li Qingping looked at Fan Xian with some fear. Fan Xian smiled. With the temple above, the emperor has the mandate of heaven to protect him. Naturally, those thieves and rascals cannot harm him. Oh! A glimmer of joy rose to Li Qingping's face. Although he knew that if his father died, he would become the next emperor of Qin Kingdom under the protection of his teacher and brother, he was, after all, still a youth. His thoughts were not that ruthless. Fan Xian pretended not to care, but he carefully paid attention to the change of emotions in Li Qingping's eyes. He thought to himself that he had indeed not seen wrong. In the future, the emperor will probably often have you come to the royal study to listen. After Fan Xian said this, he paused and slowly opened his mouth to say, "Your Highness should first familiarize yourself with the place." The third prince had come to the royal study before and knew that his brothers, the crown prince, his second brother, his eldest brother, and even his teacher would always listen to his father and the officials discuss matters in the royal study after the court meeting. However, after today this royal study would probably be much emptier. "There are many things that probably no one dares to say to your highness," Fan Xian said calmly after thinking for a moment. "But I must tell you." The emperor was about to return. Fan Xian had to give his own explanation to the third prince because he knew that this child's thoughts were actually very meticulous. Earlier he had always used your highness to refer to him. The great prince's nature is martial. In the future he will be sent to the borders to guard. Fan Xian's expression was slightly heavy. Using his own words, he described the emperor's future plans. His nature is straightforward. He will not take the initiative to do anything that will harm the brotherhood. You can rest assured on this point. Don't be suspicious. The third prince's hand trembled. Looking at his teacher's face, he didn't know why he was suddenly saying this. "As for me, I will eventually leave. The world is so big. I have to go to the ends of the earth to take a look. Only then will I not have wasted my life." Fan Xian smiled slightly. "So, don't be suspicious of me. Even after you grow up, don't be suspicious of me." The third prince opened his mouth wide. For some reason he felt a glimmer of fear. "These are not words that an official should say," Fan Xian withdrew his smile and calmly said. "But I want to say it to you. In the 20 years of my life, I have grown tired of guessing and testing each other's intentions. Regardless of whether or not you still believe these words when you grow up, please remember these words." Just as he had said, these words had already violated the emperor's family's great taboo. Furthermore, they had come from the mouth of an official. Yet Fan Xian had said them so calmly and naturally. Li Qingping looked in a daze at his teacher's originally handsome but slightly sallow face and unconsciously nodded his head. 3 days had passed. Jingdo had already been pacified. The 3 riders once again entered the capital and announced to the world the news of the emperor's return from worshipping heaven. The Jingdo people, still shaken, were overjoyed. Standing on the palace walls, Fan Xian didn't know what they were happy about after suffering so much. The emperor's scheduled return to the capital was 3 days late. During these 3 days, the Dingzhou army's military intelligence reports came endlessly to the capital through the military and Overwatch Council's channels. Fan Xian had enough of being a regent. With both hands he held the emperor's royal seal and randomly stamped it. On this day the news finally arrived. Fan Xian brought the 3rd prince, the great prince, and the surviving royalist old officials through the streets that still had the marks of war. Walking out of Xingyang Gate they stopped 10 li away. Thousands of people knelt down densely. There was no space on the road. Many people knelt directly in the wheat fields on either side of the road. At this time the autumn harvest had not arrived. The golden ears of wheat survived the trampling of the war horses and swayed in the wind with the heavy harvest. Countless people's emotions swayed like the ears of wheat as they watched the bright yellow royal entourage coming from afar. Fan Xian pulled his gaze back from the wheat fields and smiled slightly at the nervous and joyful 3rd prince beside him. After canvassing for votes yesterday, I rushed to 2nd place in the monthly votes. In my memory this seems to be the first time in the Qingyu year that I have reached 2nd place. Although the 2nd prince died quite tragically today, I am still as nervous and joyful as the 3rd prince. Alas, I have lived most of my life as a bachelor. Thank you. Chapter 585. The royal carriage slowly arrived and steadily stopped on the road. Because of the chaos and panic of the battle, the road had not been paved with yellow earth or sprinkled with water. However, the emperor's feet still did not have any hesitation. Firmly and steadily, he walked down the steps and stepped onto the land around Jingdo. The emperor moved his hand away from eunuch Yao's elbow. His calm gaze slowly swept across the wilderness. Thousands of officials and soldiers were kneeling on the ground and worshipping him. His expression was indifferent, but there was not much emotion in his eyes. Amidst the earth-shaking mountain cries, the emperor's gaze moved closer from the distant Jingdo walls and landed nearby. It flashed past the scholars Hu and Shu, the great prince in martial attire, and his nervous and slightly happy youngest son. In the end, it lightly landed on Fan Xian's handsome and threatening face. He noticed that there was a strong sense of tiredness on this boy's face. The corners of the emperor's lips twitched slightly with a hint of joy. It was as if he was growing to like this pretty face more and more in the depths of his heart. His brows immediately furrowed because he found that Fan Xian had suffered a serious internal injury. Spreading out his bright yellow dragon robe, the emperor stretched out his arms. Calmly and domineeringly, he faced the wilderness in front of him. The mountain cries gradually stopped. If no one dared to look at the emperor, how could these thousands of people know the emperor's actions? From the moment they got out of the car, the emperor's gaze had basically landed on Fan Xian. Fan Xian felt uncomfortable all over, but he kept his head down. He didn't know how to react. After hearing the cheers, the emperor's feet gradually moved toward them. Just as he was about to walk in front of Fan Xian, the emperor suddenly changed his direction and did not look at Fan Xian again. Solemnly he helped Shu Wu and Hu the scholar to their feet. His hands gripped old Shu's shoulders. Using a gentle and firm tone he said, "You've suffered." Shu Wu's heart jumped. Fear appeared on his face. Hu the scholar also repeatedly said he didn't dare. The emperor smiled and didn't say anything. Immediately after, he helped up the great prince, who had led the soldiers in the Jingdo battle and achieved great merit. The emperor's emotions toward this eldest son he had never liked much were complicated, but his expression was calm. Following this, the emperor pulled Li Qingping up and used his right hand to gently stroke his youngest son's head for a while. His gaze looked around at the officials loyal to him and didn't say a word. Then he turned around and walked back to the royal carriage. Everyone was dumbfounded, thinking that it was over just like that. It was not about whether or not the emperor's return ceremony had finished. Rather, it was about the most meritorious service in protecting the country, the Duke of Donbua, still kneeling stiffly on the ground. Why did the emperor not say anything at all? Shu Wu and Hu the scholar met each other's eyes and saw the confusion in each other's eyes. Fan Xian was also a bit confused. He didn't know if he should stand up. Get up. Could it be that you won't be able to stand up if I don't help you up? Before he boarded the royal carriage, the emperor lightly tossed out these words to the crowd. Although these words did not point to anyone, everyone knew that they were directed at Fan Xian. Furthermore, they appeared cold, but in reality, there was a sliver of closeness within. As for the other meaning hidden in these words, only Fan Xian could understand. The emperor had already recognized his ability and loyalty. Without needing his support, he could also stand in his own position in court. Fan Xian laughed bitterly and stood up. He lowered his head to look at the dirt on his knees. Logically speaking, the emperor had not yet boarded the carriage. As an official, he could not clean up his appearance. However, an impulse came from somewhere and made his right hand brush at his knees, brushing away some of the dirt. This small action did not attract too much attention. It made the emperor's figure, who was about to board the royal carriage, pause slightly. Then everyone heard the emperor's words. "And Ji, come into the carriage." The officials began to stare dumbfounded again. They looked at each other and sank into shock. Earlier, the emperor had not personally helped Fan Xian stand up. Everyone had some guesses. Who would have thought that the emperor would immediately give Sir Fan Jr. such an honor to follow the emperor into the capital? What kind of honor was this? Even the crown prince had never enjoyed it in the past. The gazes of the clever officials toward Fan Xian became heated. However, these officials appeared too clever, or perhaps they thought they were clever. Some of their gazes involuntarily landed on the third prince. Everyone knew that the crown prince and the second prince would not have a good ending because of the rebellion. At the beginning, everyone thought that the future master of the Qin kingdom would be this young prince. Looking at the emperor's attitude. The reason these officials thought they were clever was because they had displayed an inappropriate attitude in an inappropriate place. The scholars Hu and Shu looked down as if they had not heard the emperor's words at all. This was the difference between high-ranking officials and officials. Fan Xian tasted bitterness in his mouth, but he could not go against the imperial edict. He walked to the side of the tall royal carriage, lifted the yellow curtain, and stood in front of the emperor. Although the royal carriage was tall, it was still unable to allow a person to stand straight. The emperor still had his head down and said, "When the matter is done, brush off one's clothes and leave, hide one's body and name deeply. These are the words you once wrote. However, don't hope that I will let you go. When the matter is done, the matter is not over. Why is a young man like you in a hurry to brush off your clothes and leave?" The emperor's eyes looked at the memorial. These words seemed to have been spoken unintentionally, but Fan Xian's heart thumped. He didn't know what to say. When the matter was done, brush off one's clothes and leave. He had not thought that his unconsciously brushing off the dust in front of the royal carriage would allow the emperor to guess his thoughts. Furthermore, the emperor had resolutely and mercilessly dispelled his illusions or probing in his heart. He laughed bitterly and didn't dare to hide anything. Straightforwardly he said, "I am truly not good at things like fighting wars. It's better to peacefully earn some money for the court." Fan Xian had other plans in his heart, so he rushed to speak clearly. Unexpectedly, the emperor suddenly raised his head and looked at him. "Don't think about resigning. If you are still afraid of what people say, I will naturally do the matter of reducing your power." Fan Xian cried out bitterly in his heart. The emperor's words had forced him into a corner. If he was truly forced to stay in Jingdo to plot, he did not want his power to be reduced. The Overwatch Council was the most powerful weapon in his hands. If the emperor actually tore it open, what would he use to negotiate terms with this unfathomable emperor? Until now, he still didn't know the truth of what happened on Dong Mountain. He didn't dare to open his mouth to ask in the carriage. It was the emperor who spoke first and asked about the specific situation in Jingdo. Although Jingdo had continuously sent memorials to the royal carriage during these 3 days, the matter involved the secret of the royal family. There were many things that could only be reported personally by Fan Xian to the emperor. Fan Xian's voice rang out in the carriage. From the moment he left Dong Mountain to when he disguised himself as an oil merchant to enter Jingdo, to the later plan with the great prince, the surprise attack on the royal palace, and finally the Yi family's attack, he spoke methodically and clearly. He purposely downplayed some details that the emperor presumably did not want to hear. When Fan Xian made his report, the emperor had already lowered his head again. That was why he carefully watched the emperor's expression and reaction. Unexpectedly, regardless of whether it was the news of the eldest princess' death or the second prince's suicide, none of them made the emperor's stone-like face tremble at all. It was only when he reported the Empress Dowager's illness that the emperor raised his head. "How many days does the Empress Dowager have left?" "I've seen her at the Imperial Academy of Medicine. Her body is weak and she has experienced such a major event. She has been frightened. I'm afraid." Fan Xian stopped talking. He had a malicious thought toward the cold emperor. The Empress Dowager was scared to death by you. What should you, as a filial emperor, do? The Imperial Academy of Medicine? The emperor furrowed his brows and looked at him coldly. What is the use of those pieces of trash? You were in the palace. Don't you know the details? Fan Xian said darkly, it is indeed not something a person can reverse. Under the gazes and protection of countless people, the emperor's entourage entered Jingdo. Following the wide and straight Tianhe Avenue, it entered the royal palace. Along the way, the common people who had just suffered the disaster of war forcefully suppressed the sorrow or fear in their hearts and joyfully welcomed the emperor's return. It was as if they were welcoming back the backbone of their lives. From this, it could be seen that the emperor's prestige and reputation among the Qing people was still as strong and unbreakable as monarchical power itself. Arriving at the front doors of the royal palace, Fan Xian retreated from the carriage with his body bent. Meeting the great prince's gaze, he shook his head, indicating that the emperor's mood was fine and had not been affected by the successive news of deaths. Fan Xian followed the carriage into the palace. Looking at the bright yellow curtains, he couldn't help but think of the emperor's expression earlier. Involuntarily he felt a chill in his heart. Although the eldest princess and the second prince were both the masterminds of the rebellion, they were, after all, the emperor's own sister and son. Furthermore, looking at the rebellion now, it was clear that the emperor had purposely set up a trap for the other party. Yet, after learning of the death of his sister and son, the emperor was still calm. This determination, this cold-bloodedness, truly made him shiver in fear. The great prince walked to his side and said in a heavy voice, "Why did you come down? Did you dare to sit all the way into the palace?" Fan Xian glanced at him and explained in a low voice, "The emperor asked some questions in the carriage. You know that it is not convenient to announce these things in public." There was originally no need to explain anything to the great prince. However, Fan Xian looked at the gazes focused on him from all around. He knew what kind of discussion and consequences it would cause if he followed the royal entourage into the capital, so he unconsciously added this sentence. After he finished, he felt that talking to the great prince like this would probably have the opposite effect. He smiled bitterly and said, "It was too cold in the carriage, so I came down to stretch my bones." The great prince smiled and patted his shoulder. He didn't say anything. These two brothers were actually both forcing themselves to smile. Guarding Jingdo to prevent the ruler of a country from becoming a lonely spirit in the land, without question, they had performed a great service, a great service. However, so many people in the royal family had died, and they had used so many tricks. Who knew what the emperor was thinking? The Qing emperor didn't think of anything. In the process of arranging to wipe out the rebel army outside the capital, he had already learned of Li Yunrui and Li Qing's deaths from the urgent documents Fan Xian had sent. In the carriage, he only learned the specific circumstances of their deaths from Fan Xian's mouth. His expression was calm, as if the people who had died were strangers. He continued to look at the memorials the Hall of Governmental Affairs had presented. When the royal entourage entered the palace and Fan Xian got off the carriage, the emperor put down the memorial in his hands. Leaning against the back of the chair, he closed his eyes and said nothing in silence. The lonely silence continued for a long time. A glimmer of old age and haggard gradually appeared on the emperor's face. At this moment, the carriage had already stopped in front of Han Dian. He gently sighed and slowly walked out of the carriage curtain that Eunuch Yao had pulled up. Once he was out of the curtain, he looked down at the familiar yet strange palace. His expression quickly became calm and solemn. There was no longer a trace of the gloominess he had when he was alone in the carriage. Every brow and gaze conveyed his strength and strength. The Empress Dowager wore a plain white dress and lay on the warm and soft phoenix bed. The wrinkles on her face were deep. It was as if she had once faced too much wind and rain with this royal palace and had been eroded to this state. The emperor said something to the terrified imperial physician kneeling on the ground. He then sat by the side of the bed and placed his slender fingers on the Empress Dowager's wrist. Fan Xian and the other two brothers stood obediently behind the curtain, not daring to disturb them. Fan Xian's heart was faintly nervous. He could faintly see that the emperor's technique in taking the pulse was very skilled. It was clear that he also had some understanding of medicine. However, he had more confidence in Sir Fei Jie's medicine. Most importantly, that pill was not poison. Regardless of whether it was the Imperial Academy of Medicine or other brilliant doctors, presumably, none of them would be able to find the true reason for the Empress Dowager's gradual decline. Instead, they would straightforwardly conclude that she was getting old and weak and that her fate was coming to an end. The emperor's slender fingers had already left the Empress Dowager's weak pulse. He lowered his head and thought deeply for a moment. A glimmer of helplessness flashed through his eyes. It looked like this great grandmaster also knew that he could not delay his mother's departure. Then his brows suddenly furrowed. His finger moved like the wind and tapped between the Empress Dowager's brows. With the tap, the atmosphere in Hongguang Palace changed. The cold autumn wind was dispersed by a wave of unstoppable sunlight. A powerful and upright aura passed into everyone's heart. Fan Xian suddenly felt the aura behind the curtain. His heart jumped and his fingers began to tremble rapidly. Although this aura was not familiar, it was as harmonious as the Jinqi in his body. However, it was many levels higher than his realm. Faintly, it was the realm he had always longed for but had never been able to find the door to. He abruptly raised his head and stared in a daze through the thin curtain. A voice in his heart cried out to him, "This is the second half of the volume." This was the second half of the volume that he had practiced for 20 years but had no progress at all. I seem to have made the same mistake as the rapeseed flower and vermilion bird. It looks like I am walking down the path of not distinguishing between the 5 grains. Fortunately, this is the Qin kingdom. The title of this chapter is the second half of the father and son. Everyone should know that this is a pun. This story is about to enter the final stage. There are still about 6 or 7 more chapters in this volume. Then it will enter the last volume, Emperor of the Dynasty. I have confidence that this is a corrected version. I mistyped the name of the last volume earlier. Chapter 586. The reason I updated late today was because of the men's basketball finals. I really couldn't help but finish reading, so I finished late. Also, at the end of the chapter, I narcissistically said 4 words, "I have confidence." Then, I immediately realized that I had gotten the name of the last volume wrong. Although I changed it later, the last volume was Chaotian Tianzi. Readers with good memories should remember that I mentioned it before. After Fan Xian came to this world, he had begun to learn the nameless martial secret his mother had supposedly left for him when he was still a baby. It was a thin book with yellow pages. The martial secret was divided into 2 volumes. Wu Zhu had once said to him that the first volume was tyrannical. What about the second volume? Only an irresponsible male nanny like Wu Zhu would so casually hold such a dangerous martial secret by an infant's side. Only a strange creature like Fan Xian would begin to practice before he even knew how to run. Fan Xian took afternoon naps and then another. 16 years of afternoon naps were 16 years of quiet cultivation. Because he was greedy for life and afraid of death, his willpower was astonishing. Even after he entered the capital, his cultivation still did not slack off. After 20 years of hard cultivation, he was as familiar with the first and second volumes of the nameless martial secret as he could be. From the age of 3 he had stopped reading books. They were all deeply imprinted in his mind. When he was 12, Wu Zhu's staff hit him and he broke through the bottleneck of the tyrannical martial secret. After many years of life and death fighting, the shattering of his meridians in the alleys of Jingdo behind the Hanging Temple, the mutual meditation with Haitang on the trip to Jiangnan, and using the natural heart of Tianyi Dao to heal his wounds, his control of the tyrannical Jinqi had reached a near-perfect realm. Presently he was one of the youngest 9th-level aces in the world. He knew that he was not a genius like Haitang and 13th Wang. It was just that the meridians in his body were different from others. Furthermore, he had put in time and energy that others could not. Heaven rewarded the diligent, and Fan Xian had won in the word diligent. However, he still had no way of dealing with the second half of the nameless martial secret because the Jinqi in the second half of the book, as well as the path of circulation, appeared very strange. Never mind normal people in the world, even a strange creature like him with thick meridians had no way of dealing with it. Yes, there was a mountain of treasures in front of him, but he couldn't even find the path up the mountain because the clear light on the mountain was attracting him. However, if he wanted to climb the mountain he would be forced to dig out this mountain. Who could do that? If the tyrannical Jinqi needed to be supported by a vast meridian, then the second half of the manual required even more terrifying. Every time Fan Xian made no progress in his cultivation, he would feel extremely disappointed. Occasionally he would think that unless there were no meridians in the entire body, or to put it another way, a person's meridians were all connected and scattered among the organs and limbs, it would be impossible to cultivate the second half of the scroll. For many years, Fan Xian had been troubled by this problem. He could not find any possibility of a breakthrough. Uncle Wu Zhu had never practiced Jinqi. When he was in Jiangnan he had occasionally said a few vague words to Haitang, but Haitang only shook her head. This kind of Jinqi method required a person without meridians. It was clearly a joke. A person without meridians was, without question, a dead person. Thus, during this year, Fan Xian gradually gave up on the idea of practicing the second half of the nameless martial secret. If Wu Zhu had not told him many years ago that someone had successfully practiced this martial secret, Fan Xian would probably have thought that the second half of the nameless martial secret was a terrifying joke used by previous sages to harm people. Now Fan Xian was outside Hongguang Palace's curtain. He clearly and with incomparable shock felt that kind of realm, a realm he had never reached or even seen before. It seeped out from behind the curtain and attacked his heart. If the tyrannical Jinshi was a mountain-splitting axe, then the aura in the curtain was like the lightning blade in the hands of a god. The aura was even more pure and exquisite. It was neutral and peaceful, upright and upright. It came out of the blue and spread between heaven and earth, immediately making one feel a sense of worship. Fan Xian knew he could not be wrong. This kind of aura definitely came from the same source as the tyrannical Jinshi in his body. It was just that the realm was a few levels higher. When a realm that he had searched up and down for over a dozen years and could not understand suddenly appeared in front of his eyes, his entire body froze. He sank into some kind of imperceptible excitement. Other than excitement, he even felt a glimmer of fear. The emperor lifted the curtain and walked out. Glancing at everyone, he quietly said, "The Empress Dowager is tired. You all go wait outside the palace." No one knew what the emperor wanted to say. They bowed to receive the edict. Only Fan Xian remained standing in a daze. With his head half lowered, he looked at the emperor's dragon robe in a daze. The corners of the emperor's lips curled up slightly as he smiled. He knew that his son had sensed something. If it wasn't for the fact that this boy had been practicing the tyrannical martial method since he was young, how could anyone else have such a deep understanding and such a strong shock? Fan Xian's dazed appearance was actually mostly faked. He knew that in front of the emperor, he could not completely hide the shock in his heart. He simply let down his defenses and naturally revealed the thoughts in his mind. The emperor was a great grandmaster. The emperor had practiced the second half of the scroll. Fan Xian knew that the emperor knew that he could know, so he had to show his shock and terror. The emperor looked at him and slowly said a moment later, "Go to the Eastern Palace and wait for me. If you have anything to say, say it later." Fan Xian swallowed and smiled bitterly. After bowing, he left Hongguang Palace. The palace returned to its silence. Other than the Empress Dowager, who was lying on the bed and unable to make a single sound, there was also the emperor sitting quietly by the bed. The emperor sat silently by the Empress Dowager's side. He held her hand gently in his palm and lowered his head to think about the scene earlier. That child should know and have guessed it. The emperor had not planned to continue hiding these things from Fan Xian. After all, after the battle at Dong Mountain, there was no need to continue hiding it. Other than Fan Xian, there shouldn't be anyone else who could sense the uniqueness of the martial secret the emperor practiced. Thinking of Fan Xian's shocked expression earlier, the emperor's expression softened. He thought to himself that he had suffered all these years. He had to make it up to him. However, regarding this martial secret, even if he wanted to make it up to him, Fan Xian would not be able to accept it. He glanced at the Empress Dowager again. The emperor's expression was slightly dim. Just as Fan Xian had guessed, even a great grandmaster would not be able to sense the slightest change in the old woman's body. The secret medicine that Fei Jie had solemnly handed over indeed had its own wonders. The emperor sat by the bed thinking about something. After a long time, he suddenly opened his mouth and said in a gentle voice, "Mother, I still have many things I want to tell you and many glories I want to share with you." His hand gently held the Empress Dowager's hand. His body was not very tall and straight. On the contrary, it was slightly timid. Even the most heartless person in the world would probably feel some unease and sorrow as they watched their birth mother gradually leave this world. Faint gauze fluttered in the early autumn Hongguang Palace. The emperor's face grew paler and paler. His grip on the Empress Dowager's hand grew tighter and tighter. Large amounts of pure kingly jinqi poured endlessly into the Empress Dowager's body. Perhaps it was the realm of a great grandmaster that could truly slow down the pace of death's arrival. Perhaps anyone would have a moment before death. The Empress Dowager's eyelids trembled slightly. Her eyeballs moved slightly. It was as if she was about to open her eyes and wake up. However, she still could not open them. The emperor knew that this was the last time his mother would hear a sound. His body felt a chill. Kneeling properly by the bed, he held his mother's old hand with both hands. Moving his lips close to the Empress Dowager's ear, he said, "Mother, I did not disappoint you. Ku He and Sigujien are both dead. This world will, in the end, belong to the Qin kingdom." Like a child, the emperor intimately and reluctantly recounted what had happened by the Empress Dowager's ear. He even told her his secret of being a great grandmaster. He was like a joyful child telling his mother that he had gotten full marks on today's test. He knew his mother only had a very short amount of time. He wanted her to leave more happily. At the end of his final farewell, the expression of the emperor, who was always like a collapsing mountain in front of him, suddenly became heavy. It was as if he was thinking about some important question. After thinking for a long time, he finally made up his mind. By the Empress Dowager's ear, he said, "Mother, 20 years ago, I listened to you. 20 years later, I have decided to listen to myself. And she is a good child." No one knew if the Empress Dowager, whose life force was gradually extinguished and whose old body was as powerless as a piece of wood, heard these words or understood the shocking news contained in them. The Empress Dowager's body suddenly froze. The emperor furrowed his brows and turned his eyes to look at his mother's face. The Empress Dowager suddenly opened her eyes. She struggled to make a sound in her throat. Because of the loosening of her vocal cords, she could not make a sound. The last of the power of her life exploded out. It still could not allow her to break through the limit of her life. In the end, the energy in her body and the effects of the medicine only turned into endless hatred, regret, and dissatisfaction in her eyes. Fan Xian walked into the Eastern Palace and made preparations for the emperor's arrival. He knew that the scene that was about to happen was, without question, a not uncommon scene of father and son killing each other in the 1,000-year history of the land. His heart couldn't help but chill. It was not just because of Li Qingxian's fate these years. It was also because of the facts he had learned earlier in Hongguang Palace and the emperor's last words. "If you have anything to say, say it later." A cold smile rose to the corners of his lips. The emperor had mastered the nameless martial secret before him. He was the most mysterious great grandmaster in the palace. No wonder he had been able to return alive from Dong Mountain. No wonder he had not seen eunuch Hong in the group returning to the capital. It looked like Hong Xixiang had already completed his historical mission. The emperor, with the dignity of an emperor and the strength of a great grandmaster, had changed from the role of prey to the hunter on the summit of Dong Mountain. Adding on Yi Luyun, it was no wonder Sigurjian and Ku He had fallen to such a state. He sighed. His mood was dim. Once again he confirmed the emperor's cold-blooded heartlessness. That year, his meridians had shattered and he had almost lost his life. At the very least, he had lost all of his cultivation. The emperor had once sent eunuch Hong into the Fan Manor to check on his injuries. Given his great grandmaster strength, how could he not know what had happened? Furthermore, he was also someone who practiced the nameless martial secret. If there was anyone in the world who could break the side effects of the tyrannical martial secret, it could only be the emperor. However, he had still not said anything. If it weren't for Haitang's help, he would probably be lying paralyzed in bed and unable to rise for the rest of his life. Thinking of this, Fan Xian's heart chilled again. Father has returned to the palace safely. It seems that your mood is not very good. The crown prince, Li Qingxian, sat behind a clean table with a warm smile on his face. He looked at Fan Xian and took a sip of the slightly cold tea. It was as if he was enjoying his last moments in the world. Fan Xian forced a smile. He kept feeling that he had heard these words somewhere before. It was as if all of his enemies could guess it. His mood was not good. The emperor will arrive in a moment. Fan Xian looked into Li Qingxian's eyes. Li Qingxian did not shrink back in the slightest. Now that things had come to this, he no longer had any other thoughts. A few days of house arrest was enough for him to think clearly about many problems. In particular, the successive deaths of his mother and aunt made his mood as clear as a cold pond. Everyone will die. Mother is dead. And is dead. Li Qingxian slowly put down the teacup in his hand and looked at Fan Xian. Father will also die in the future. It is just a matter of order. Fan Xian thought for a bit and quietly said, "The second prince is also dead." Li Qingxian lowered his head. He had been imprisoned deep in the palace and had no idea what had happened these few days. He immediately raised his head and said with a complicated expression, "I have fought with him for so many years. I didn't think that in the end, even in death, we would have to fight to be first and last. We die first and go first." Li Qingxian looked at Fan Xian and said, "Then we will wait for you." Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly. He knew that they each had their own pride. Warmly he said, "Then you have to fight for a good position for me." Li Qingxian waved his hand confidently and said, "When one is alive, one can be as lively as one wants. Death is a lonely matter. Of course, one has to fight for one's own position." Fan Xian was slightly startled. He thought of a phrase in his heart, "Live together, die alone." When he had seen this phrase in his previous life, he had always found it difficult to express the hidden meaning in Chinese. Recently, he had seen countless people die one after another and heard Li Qingxian's words. Only then did he understand that this phrase was just an overlay of countless realities. Fan Xian's heart suddenly tightened. He didn't know that in Hongguang Palace, the Empress Dowager had opened her eyes. He unconsciously looked in that direction with slight fear. If the Empress Dowager had truly woken up, he would probably be in big trouble. This fear came from the bottom of his heart. In the past, no matter who he faced, he had never been truly afraid. Now he knew that the Emperor was a great grandmaster. One person stood at the pinnacle of the martial realm and worldly power. What difference was there between him and a god who had descended into the mortal world? Immediately after, the ringing of the bells in the royal palace rang out and resonated in all directions. Fan Xian lowered his head and silently counted the number of times the bells had rung. After confirming the news of the Empress Dowager's death, his mood relaxed slightly. Immediately, it became empty again. Opposite him, Li Qingqian had completely different news. Hearing that the Empress Dowager, who loved him the most, had also left alone, his face was slightly pale. In a trembling voice he said to Fan Xian, "There is no need to see me off." Fan Xian raised his hands calmly in greeting and said, "Go in peace." Li Qingqian's words were not completely correct. Death was indeed the loneliest thing in the world. But, before death, it was often the most lively time in the world. An old man was waiting for the god of death on his bed, while his relatives and juniors surrounded the bed, chattering non-stop. It was very annoying. The Eastern Palace was also like this. Fan Xian waited outside the palace. After a long time he heard the dense sound of footsteps. The emperor, surrounded by many people, came to the Eastern Palace and entered alone. Li Qingqian did not stand to welcome his father. He also did not hate the liveliness before death. He refused Fan Xian's suggestion to take a risk. He did not want to go to the ends of the earth to hide his life. He also did not act like the second prince and commit suicide by taking poison before the emperor returned. He had many things he wanted to say to his father. He wanted to vent the resentment he had held in his heart for 20 years. If he could not vent it all, he would probably become a resentful ghost after death. How will the history books describe this? Li Qingqian looked at his father, the most powerful ruler in history, without a glimmer of fear. If a person did not fear death, then they would not fear anything. The crown prince, who had improved a lot these 2 years, said straightforwardly, "I waited for you to come back because I wanted to know if you truly did not care about anything." The Qing emperor, dressed in casual clothes, looked calmly at his son and said, "The history books are always written by the victors. Furthermore, do you think I have wronged you in any way?" The crown prince sat behind the clean table and furrowed his brows and thought for a long time. He then smiled and shook his head. "Of course not. Mother was weak, but you still made me crown prince and let me sit in this position for so many years. Of course you have not wronged me." This was not the truth because the thick mockery in it was completely revealed. The emperor coldly said, "Don't learn the cowardly and sour words of women." "Cowardly? That was forced by you. You are too dazzling. No one dares to steal your glory." The crown prince closed his eyes and stubbornly said, "I have always thought of a question. Since you have never thought of passing your power to the next generation, why did you make me crown prince?" The emperor's expression was unusually calm. He stared at him and slowly said, "Qingqian, you disappoint me. All these years I've been training you non-stop. What's the reason?" Chapter 587. Fan Xian walked out of the Eastern Palace and turned around to personally close the 2 heavy palace doors. He glanced at the densely packed crowd surrounding the Eastern Palace. His expression was calm, but an unknown emotion rolled through his heart. After he calmed down slightly, he waved his hand toward Eunuch Yao at the very front of the crowd. Eunuch Yao had accompanied the emperor through the difficult times on Dong Mountain. After Eunuch Hong sacrificed himself for the country, he had become the foremost figure in the Qing court. However, Fan Xian continued to casually wave his hand as usual. Eunuch Yao bowed and respectfully went forward to listen to the order. From this behavior, no one had any doubt that Fan Xian would have unparalleled power in the future. Fan Xian quietly said something by Eunuch Yao's ear. Eunuch Yao's expression was slightly suspicious. He didn't dare to question Fan Xian's orders. At this moment, he was unable to ask the emperor in the Eastern Palace. After some thought, he led the group of people outside the Eastern Palace to the outskirts, maintaining a long distance from the Eastern Palace. Fan Xian followed them to the side of the little forest in the palace. Looking at the quiet Eastern Palace from a distance, he guessed what the emperor and crown prince were talking about. Having the people in the palace retreat further was actually for safety's sake. He didn't know if the emperor would say something he would never want others to know once he became angry. This was also for his own consideration. Only a few people in the world knew the true reason the emperor wanted to depose the crown prince. This matter had been single-handedly woven by him. The emperor knew of his cultivation. If he stood guard outside the Eastern Palace and heard the dark secrets in the palace, no one would be happy. Fan Xian pressed his dry lips together and looked at the Eastern Palace with eyes full of worry. He thought that Qingqian was soft on the outside but hard on the inside. He was probably going to walk the same path as the second prince. Thinking about it carefully, he was actually a rather complicated person. The person who had forced the crown prince into a dead end was him. However, who would have thought that the situation would develop like this? The things he and Qin Pingping had done in secret seemed to be driving wolves to scare tigers. Unexpectedly, in the end, they had shaken out a true dragon. During these years, everyone by the emperor's side had either passively or actively stood against the emperor. Qin Pingping and Fan Xian finally succeeded in turning the emperor into a loner. Although he was loner and widowed, he was still at the top of the world. Furthermore, once his aura was released, it was as if he could swallow the sun and moon. Fan Xian couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. The situation in the Eastern Palace was not what Fan Xian had guessed. The emperor and the crown prince did not sink into some hysterical family drama quarrel because of the first few words. In the real royal family, there would never be someone as excited as Ma Jingtao. There was only coldness, gloominess, calmness, and cruelty. The emperor sat casually on the stone steps with his legs wide apart. Looking at the door of the Eastern Palace, he thought of many years ago when he waited outside the palace doors for the good news of the empress giving birth. That day there was a joyous atmosphere in the imperial palace. The empress dowager was exceptionally happy, but her own mood was also somewhat solemn. Only when the woman outside the palace, who was also pregnant, sent a letter did he become happy. He knew that the other party was indeed not an ordinary woman. She did not care about the dragon throne at all, nor did she think about seeking the seemingly alluring throne for the child in her belly. It was this attitude that made the emperor a little unhappy. After 20 years, this kind of unhappiness had long become a fading emotion. Occasionally, when he was in the little building in the rear palace and looked at the yellow-clothed woman in the painting, he couldn't resist grumbling. "And she is your child, but is he not my child?" It had been 20 years. The child who was destined to become the successor to the throne of the Qin kingdom had grown up and was sitting by his side. His long hair fell softly behind his back. There was only calm and resignation between his brows. The child in the womb of the woman outside the Eastern Palace was now outside the Eastern Palace, standing in some corner and watching the movements in the Eastern Palace. The emperor unconsciously took the teacup the crown prince had drunk from the clean table in front of the steps and brought it to his lips to take a sip. He didn't know whether it was hot or cold. In the end, the Qin kingdom has not been founded for long. For some reason, the emperor chose to speak from here. Slowly he said, although Northern Qi is only the second generation, it inherited the throne of the Wei kingdom. Its internal structure is much more stable. A dozen years ago, the Northern Qi emperor suddenly died. The empress was young and the prince was young. If it had been in the Qin kingdom, I'm afraid that the attempt to force the abdication would have succeeded. Even if Kuhi came out, it would not have succeeded. Li Qingxian's gaze landed on his father's hand holding the teacup. The reason it is like this is because the Qin kingdom has always been a country fought from the battlefield. The military is powerful and we are used to using knives and swords to reason. Things like etiquette and the might of an emperor are not very convincing. The emperor's gaze was somewhat indifferent. Thus, to be the ruler of the Qin kingdom, one cannot be blindly benevolent. One must have iron methods and a tenacious nature. He turned his head to look at his son and said, "You grew up in the palace. When you were only 8, you already had the name of benevolence." Speaking of this, a glimmer of mockery appeared at the corners of the emperor's lips. "You just helped wrap the feet of a few injured rabbits, and those servants blindly tried to win mother's favor, saying that you would certainly be a benevolent ruler in the future. Blindly benevolent is cowardice. The Qin kingdom will unify the world. For 50 years there will be endless strife. The old royal families everywhere will not be satisfied. I'm only half a century old, but I have to lay down a foundation that will last for tens of thousands of years. I only had time to conquer this country. Guarding it requires you." The emperor pulled back his gaze and said, "A benevolent ruler and a cowardly ruler, how can you guard this vast land?" Li Qingqian glanced at his father. A self-mocking smile appeared at the corners of his lips. Only now did he understand that his father had been thinking about things decades later over a decade ago. He had the confidence to unify the world, but he had to think about how the country would continue after 100 years. That is why I brought Qingzi out to fight with you. The emperor closed his eyes and slowly said, now that I think about it, at that time, you two were still young. I seem to have been a bit too hasty. Li Chengqian still did not open his mouth to reply. I had wanted to see if Qingzi, that child, would have any future prospects. However, in less than a year, I saw that his thoughts were too fake. As an emperor, he should have an awe-inspiring aura, but he did not. The emperor's eyes remained closed as if he was narrating a distant story. Thus, I was determined to pass the country to you. However, in those years your behavior truly disappointed me. You lingered around the flower houses and indulged in sensual pleasures every night, turning your body into something unrecognizable. Li Chengqian smiled self-mockingly and finally slowly opened his mouth. Father, at that time I was only 14 or 15. I was just beginning to understand the ways of the world. I wholeheartedly thought that you were going to depose me. I was terrified every night, so I could only find some feeling in a pile of cosmetics. Strangely, the emperor did not get angry after hearing these words. On the contrary, he smiled slightly and said, Qingzi was too restless, but he was clever. He finally saw clearly what I was thinking in my heart. However, he had already come out, so he could only continue walking. From this aspect, your second brother can be said to understand my heart deeply. Perhaps a knife can be ground until it breaks, but if it is not ground, it will never be sharp. The emperor opened his eyes and gazed calmly at his son. The second prince didn't sharpen you. On the contrary, he ground you dull. Coincidentally, Enji entered Jingdo. Li Chengqian smiled and thought of the first time he saw Fan Xian outside the courtyard. At that time, as the crown prince, he had never thought much of this assistant minister's son. Who would have thought that this assistant minister's son would, in the end, become his brother and become the hardest whetstone in his training for the inheritance of imperial power? You've improved a lot these 2 years. The emperor sighed and slowly said, I don't know if it's because you've matured at your age or if Yunrui has taught you many things, but everyone in court has acknowledged your identity as the crown prince. Your performance has also satisfied me. Hearing the words Yunrui, the corner of Li Chengqian's mouth twitched involuntarily. Immediately after, he let go of his heart and smiled slightly with great courage. You had me follow my aunt to learn political affairs. Naturally, there was some effect. The emperor did not get angry. He only lightly said, it is enough for the so-called political affairs to be taught to you by the scholars Shu and Hu. In reality, you also know that what I had you follow Yunrui to learn is the art of scheming. Looking around the world, you won't be able to find many better teachers than Yunrui. How good it would be to continue like this, the emperor said quietly. The emperor said quietly, there are still many things that cannot be learned. When I am old, you should have seen many things. In the end, the heart of an emperor should also be refined. Only then will I be at ease to pass this kingdom to you. Li Chengqian's mood was a bit strange. Although he had been the crown prince since he was young, his father had always been too strict with him and lacked warmth. Thus, he had developed his timid personality. Although his personality had changed a lot these 2 years, it seemed to be the first time he had sat with his father like this and talked to each other. And Ji has told me everything about the situation in Jingdo, the emperor said warmly. Your performance was not bad. You behaved appropriately during the rebellion. However, there are a few problems. For the last time, Li Chengqian, as the crown prince, knelt by the emperor's side and bowed to ask for advice. There is no need for any warmth or fear in the struggle for power in the world. He Zhongwei led the imperial censor to defy orders in court, so you should have been beaten to death. The emperor's gaze was incomparably cold. And Ji convinced the civil officials in court to challenge you during the ascension ceremony. You should have killed him. He looked at his son as if teaching him for the last time. As long as someone is in the way, just kill them. On this point, you are not as good as Enji. The emperor continued, you didn't kill the 2 scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs and those civil officials and only locked them up. What use was that? This is the biggest mistake you made in the Jingdo matter. If Yunrui had personally handled this matter and not you and mother discussing it, perhaps Jingdo would have long been stabilized and the court would have been cleansed of blood. Fan Xian would not have had the time to act. Li Chengqian smiled bitterly and let out a long sigh. Gazing at his father, he quietly said, Father, do you know why I couldn't bear to kill those officials? Without waiting for the emperor to speak, Li Chengqian faintly said, perhaps you have forgotten, at the beginning of your intention to depose the heir, it was these old officials who bravely stood out to oppose your edict and stand behind me to support me. Perhaps I am not a very powerful person, but I am someone who knows how to repay favors. Although the scholars Hu and Shu supported me for the sake of the country, I truly could not bear to act against them. The emperor was silent. No one knew what he was thinking. A moment later he suddenly opened his mouth and said, "When I decided to depose you, there were still people who helped you redeem it." Li Qingqian was startled. Immediately an image rose in his mind. On the road to Nanzhao, the green banner that had been following the diplomatic group faintly rose. He asked in surprise, "Fan Xian?" He knew 13th Wang was Fan Xian's person, but he didn't know why Fan Xian had done this. It was not until the emperor pointed it out now that he couldn't help but feel complicated emotions surge through his heart. He didn't know that the private matter between him and the eldest princess had been single-handedly destroyed by Fan Xian. He mulled it over in his heart and then thought of how Fan Xian had prepared to have him escape the royal palace at the beginning of the defeat. For a moment he couldn't help being startled. The emperor narrowed his eyes slightly and said, "And Ji is a real person. Just like you, he occasionally has his true nature. I'm not as good as him." After a moment of silence, the crown prince let out a long sigh. He then stood and kowtowed very seriously to the emperor. Solemnly he said, "Father, I have always harbored resentment toward you. To be able to hear Father's instructions today, my heart feels much better. However, before I leave I have something to say. Enough people in my family have died. Please, Father, be more lenient toward those who are still alive." Lenient meant that the emperor's methods in the past had been too harsh. The emperor's expression immediately became grave and stern. Hearing the words "before leaving," for some reason the emperor did not get angry. On the contrary, he looked at Li Qingqian with a complicated gaze. Slowly he said, "I promise you." A gust of early autumn night wind poured in from the north of the royal palace and whistled along the corridors and gardens inside the palace. It added a sense of melancholy. "Live on. I can pretend some things have never happened." The emperor opened his mouth and said something that surprised Li Qingqian. A wretched smile rose to Li Qingqian's face. He knew what kind of person his father was. The emperor valued the heart. Since he had rebelled once, he would never be able to obtain the emperor's trust again. Furthermore, the matter between him and his aunt had already touched the emperor's sore spot. Although no one knew why this was a sore spot, Li Qingqian would not accept a lifetime of house arrest. As a man of the Li family, he always had the courage to kill himself. His gaze became calm. Looking at the emperor, he quietly said, "What is the point in saying such things now? I asked earlier how exactly will this be recorded in the history books? Presently we are rebellious officials and unfilial sons. Everyone has the right to punish us. We colluded with foreign enemies and brought chaos to the palace. You are a dazzling ruler. You have done nothing wrong. Everything wrong is someone else's." The emperor's expression had already recovered its calm. Quietly he listened to Li Qingqian's indifferent tone and bone-piercing words. "You seem to have forgotten something. No matter how the history books erase it, you have to remember how many people died in Jingdou in the early autumn of the 7th year of the Qing calendar. The Li family lost a grandmother, an empress, an eldest princess, a crown prince and a prince." Li Qingqian sighed. For the first time, he used an equal and even superior gaze to look at his undefeatable father. "You will be an emperor in the history books. Yet by your side it is so clean that there is not a single person. Will you not be lonely?" The emperor looked at him coldly and didn't say anything. There was a slight smile at the corners of his lips. It was as if to say that as a god above the 9 heavens, how could he care about the loneliness at the top of the clouds or the liveliness of the mortal world? Then he stood up and walked out of the eastern palace. When he reached the palace doors, his heart jumped. He took out a letter from his sleeve. This was the second prince's will. Earlier, Gong Dian had given it to him. The emperor took out the thin piece of paper to see just what his second son wanted to tell him before he died. There were 2 lines of incomparably messy words on the paper. The brush strokes were dried up. It was clear that it had been written in a hurry. However, the turns were powerful. Like a knife or sword piercing the back of the paper, it was filled with anger and dissatisfaction. The third prince, Li Qingze, the first whetstone the Qing emperor had thrown to the court, shouted something similar to the crown prince's in his last will to his lofty father. However, the words he used were more bone-piercing and cutting, particularly the last 4 words. Widowed, widowed, lonely, lonely. Old and without a wife was widowed. Ruling over the world without anyone close to him was widowed. Losing one's mother was lonely. Old and without a son was lonely. In the battle that stretched from Dong Mountain to Jingdou, the Qing emperor had defeated 2 great grandmasters in a row. He had lured out and purged the restless elements in the royal family and military, and picked out the sinister traitors in court. In one move, he had established the great achievement of unifying the world. This grand situation that had been constructed for decades had become reality. Without question, it was the most glorious time of the Qing Emperor's life. However, the Empress was dead. The woman from back then had long died. The Empress Dowager had died. The eldest princess, who had accompanied the emperor for 20 years and sacrificed her youth for him, had also died. The crown prince had died. The second prince had died. Everyone had died. Only the emperor was left, a lonely and desolate man. The Qing emperor looked coldly at the letter. His fingers trembled slightly. With a rustling sound, the letter turned into a pile of white powder and slid down between his fingers. Blown by the autumn wind outside the eastern palace, it scattered in all directions like a bleak snowfall. A glimmer of pain flashed through his eyes. His brows were furrowed tightly. The words his two sons said before they died pierced deeply into this ruler's heart. The white hair on the middle-aged man's temples grew darker. His gaze gradually dimmed. There seemed to be wetness at the corners of his eyes. However, his body remained straight and strong, unmoving. The doors of the eastern palace once again closed tightly. No one knew what had happened inside. Everyone knew that the dethroned crown prince, Li Qingqian, would certainly spend his last moments in this cold and cheerless palace. However, at some point the royal palace's bell rang out again. Perhaps it was disdainful. It only coldly and emotionlessly watched his death. The emperor sent away all of the servants, leaving only Fan Xian to accompany him. Silently he walked deep into the rear palace. Along the way he passed the Qin corridor, the cold palace, and the overgrown weeds. Once again he came to the little building that no one had come to for a long time. The father and son did not go up the building or look at the portrait in it. The emperor only glanced silently at the little building a few times. He then resolutely turned and left, following the path of autumn grass toward a place where no one was around. Fan Xian silently followed 3 steps behind him. There was a heaviness in the depths of his heart. There was no need to disguise it. It was truly heavy. Faintly he could guess the emperor's current feelings. So many of his family members had died one after another. Although these family members were enemies he had to eliminate, no one could escape the ties of flesh and blood. The emperor was like a god, but he was still a mortal person. The Grand Supreme could forget emotions, but if he truly was the Grand Supreme, why struggle and struggle in this secular world? The successive deaths made even Fan Xian's emotions suppressed, much less the emperor. No matter what was said, this tired-looking middle-aged man was, in the end, a father, an elder brother, a husband, and a son. The two of them stood in the weeds up to their knees and maintained a tacit silence, looking at the quiet royal palace in the night. The emperor did not speak. Fan Xian was even more afraid to speak. He only carefully watched the expression on his profile. The emperor was silent for a long time and still did not speak. He had many things he wanted to say to someone, but Fan Xian was only his son. Let's return to the palace. Yes, Fan Xian replied. His expression was heavy. The emperor turned his head and happened to see this expression. His heart darkened slightly. His feelings toward his son grew increasingly better. Additionally, the crown prince's words earlier involuntarily made the emperor sink into deep thought again. After thinking for a moment, the emperor waved his hand weakly and said, "If you are still not feeling well, come into the palace and ask me." Fan Xian's heart jumped. He knew what these words meant. Just as he was about to say something, he found that the emperor had already turned and left. Returning to the royal study and eating some supper, the emperor felt a bit tired. Fan Xian wanted to leave the palace but was stopped by the emperor. It seemed that he desperately needed someone to accompany him. After a while, eunuch Yao came in and quietly said something. The emperor nodded and had Fan Xian return to his manor to rest. He would enter the palace to discuss matters the next day. Fan Xian accepted the order and left. In the long corridor outside the royal study, he heard a familiar sound. It was the sound of a wheelchair rolling on the ground. He knew the emperor was watching him from behind. In the dim light of the royal study, his expression was warm. He bowed deeply to the old man in the wheelchair and said, "You're here." Chen Pingping had finally returned to Jingdo, to the royal palace and to the emperor's side. Just when the emperor was at his loneliest and most needed, the royal study was silent. There was silence in the royal study. The emperor looked at his most loyal official, his closest friend, and his most reliable comrade. He closed his eyes and said, "I have forced these sons too hard. Writing these chapters is mentally and emotionally tiring. In the end, I did not make the emperor shed tears. Crocodile tears cannot move people. Sometimes, It is just a kind of self-pity and self-comfort. However, I truly admire people like the Qing Emperor. From a certain point of view, he is the same as Yi Qingmei. They are both idealists. However, idealists do not necessarily bring about ideal results for the world. I am a profiteer, so I can only keep a respectful distance from these kinds of people. Thus, I am very serious about getting monthly votes and fighting to be in the top 3 because of the 6,000 yuan bonus. Chapter 588. It's been a long time since I wrote this. Little cotton padded jacket refers to true love for each other. I hope everyone likes this chapter. What Qin Pingping sitting in the wheelchair and the emperor sitting on the throne talked about that night would remain a mystery until many years later. No one had the right to listen. Even eunuch Yao, who never left the emperor's side, was the same. This conversation was actually similar to the 2 conversations outside the royal study within a year. The words came from the emperor's lips, entered the official's ears, and did not pass to a third person. However, the present Jingdo had long known that the events of the past few months had all been secretly planned by the emperor and director Qin. The 2 of them were only waiting for the enemy hidden in the dark to jump out and then capture them all in one fell swoop. The Qing emperor and director Qin working together was truly too powerful. They were able to keep the entire Jingdo in the dark for half a month. Only now did people remember that many years ago Director Qin had accompanied the emperor in his great undertaking of unifying the world. The old man in the wheelchair had saved the emperor a few times, and the emperor had also given him the greatest trust and honor. The older generation had never doubted Qin Pingping's loyalty to the emperor. This was a fact that had long been proven by history. It was only now that it was once again reflected. There were many speculations in the hearts of the people in Jingdo regarding this conversation. That night, when Fan Xian left the royal palace and hurried toward his manor, he did not pay attention to the conversation in the royal study. He also did not think that this conversation would have anything to do with him. He guessed that the emperor was just a bit lonely, while Qin Pingping was playing the role of a loyal official and temporary friend. The reality was not far from his guess. From a certain point of view, Fan Xian and his old emperor were truly similar. If the Qing emperor was the best actor in the world, hiding it from the world for 20 years, then Fan Xian was the second best actor, hiding his thoughts in his heart and hiding it from the Qing emperor. This was an unprecedented battle of acting skills. It was a battle of the heart. Fan Xian lifted the curtain of the carriage and stared in a daze at the silent and uneasy Jingdo night streets. He thought gloomily that he had obtained the emperor's absolute trust. He had won another battle in this battle, but why fight? How would he fight in the future? The worry and anxiety on his face were not faked, but came from the depths of his heart. Especially the complicated joy, worry, and bewilderment between his brows completely expressed his current mood. Brushing past the wheelchair, Fan Xian lowered his head in greeting. He saw the glimmer of warmth and congratulations in Qin Pingping's old eyes. He immediately understood that Cece had indeed been taken away by the director. Since he had already returned to the capital, Cece had also returned to the manor. However, he didn't know if she had given birth or if it was a boy or a girl. Thinking of this, how could he still be in the mood to think about the conversation in the royal study? His entire heart had already returned to Fan Manor. He urged his subordinates to whip the horses pulling the carriage. However, too many people had died these few days. Even though he knew that he might have become a father, Fan Xian only felt a faint satisfaction and not too much ecstasy. One was grieving the death of her birth mother in the manor. After she returned to the manor, she didn't know how to deal with it. The carriage did not stop at the front gate of Fan Manor. Instead, it went straight in through a side alley and stopped at the corner gate left specially for the back garden. Without waiting for the carriage to come to a complete stop, Fan Xian had already jumped down from the carriage. Smiling, he glanced at the wife of the Teng family, who was welcoming him happily at the gate. He then walked toward his own manor. After a few steps, his smile disappeared. It was not that he was purposely putting on an act. It was truly because the arrival of a new life could not wash away the smell of blood brought by so many deaths in Jingdo. Walking past the flower hall and into the east wing, he was not surprised to find that the lights were still slightly lit. His father and Lady Lu were waiting for him in the room. The dim light shone on Minister Fan's face, illuminating his wrinkles and the joy in them. Minister Fan was looking at a baby in Lady Lu's arms. Although he managed to maintain the appearance of a stern master, he could not hide the joy in his eyes. When Fan Xian entered, he first bowed to his father and Lady Lu. He did not glance at the baby in Lady Lu's arms. Instead, he turned his gaze directly to the side of the bed. He saw Wan'er sitting by the bed, holding Cece's hand and quietly saying something. Wanner's eyes were red and swollen like pink peaches. She appeared very pitiful. Her face had also become much thinner and looked haggard. However, she forced a smile and chatted idly with Cece, who was lying on the bed. After Fan Xian paused slightly, he walked over. Not caring that the two elders were in the room, he sat directly by Wanner's side. With a face full of smiles, he looked at Cece, who was leaning against the pillow. He looked at the girl of the past and said, "You're already a mother. Why aren't you sleeping so late?" Although Cece had been frightened during the month she was about to give birth, she had the protection of the Overwatch Council. She had been taken to travel around Jingdo by Old Qin and had never been exposed to a cold. She had exercised more than a normal pregnant woman, so she looked more energetic than a normal pregnant woman. In addition, this girl had grown up with Fan Xian and had been influenced to be free and at ease. She had a broad mind and did not become haggard because of the birth of the baby. On the contrary, her face had a bit more plumpness. She looked more like a lovely young woman. "Young master, you sleep all day. How can you sleep?" Cece was still used to calling him young master. Her brows were full of joy and the pride of being a mother for the first time. However, she forcefully restrained her words. Although her personality was relaxed, she was not a heartless idiot. She knew that too many things had happened in the capital. The young mistress's heart was filled with grief. She did not want to display too much at a time like this. However, after the young master entered the room, he did not even look at the baby in Lady Lu's arms and came to the side of the bed. Cece began to ponder in her heart. Could it be that she had given birth to a daughter and the young master was not happy? Her eyes dimmed a little. Even though Fan Xian was clever, he was still unclear about the thoughts of the women in the back of the manor. Looking at the girl's expression, he thought she was sad because she had no one to accompany her during childbirth. He smiled and prepared to open his mouth to comfort her. He didn't understand, but Lin Wan'er would understand, and Lady Lu would also understand. Seeing Lady Lu carrying the baby over to the bed, Wan'er smiled and gave Fan Xian a look. Quietly she said, "Go look at the girl." Fan Xian was startled. He turned his head and saw Lady Lu looking at him with a slightly reproachful expression. Only then did he understand where the problem was. He smiled bitterly and took the baby from Lady Lu's arms. Carefully holding it in his hands, he looked at it and found that the baby in the swaddling clothes, the little baby girl, was not good-looking. Not only was she not as good-looking as Fan Xian, she was also not as good-looking as Cece's big eyes. As he looked at her, he couldn't help but laugh. He felt that he was being a bit silly. A newborn baby naturally could not be said to be good-looking. As long as it was healthy, it was fine. Lady Lu and the other three women saw him carelessly take the baby and were startled. They did not react and looked at him nervously, afraid that he did not know how to hold the baby. Lady Lu was about to reach out and snatch the baby back, but she did not expect Fan Xian to bend his left elbow slightly and support his neck with his arm. His right hand lightly clapped. Seeing this, everyone let out a sigh of relief, including Minister Fan. They all looked at Fan Xian in surprise. Wan'er, who had been depressed for a long time, could not help but secretly laugh. At this moment, Fan Xian only cared about looking at his daughter. How could he care about how others looked at him? He did not think that in this world, there were very few men who were willing to hold a child, especially in a rich family like theirs. Furthermore, he was so familiar with it, like he was an old nanny. Everyone was stunned. Fan Xian held the baby and spoke gently to Cece. "The situation has been unstable lately and it has been hard on you. But you know me. It is not that I do not look at the child when I enter the house because I do not like my daughter. It is just that in my eyes, children are not as important as adults. Your safety is the most important thing." Having been secretly reprimanded by Lady Lu and Wan'er, Fan Xian naturally knew why Cece had been sad. He smiled and explained a little. He did not take it to heart, but he did not think that when his words fell into Wan'er and Cece's hearts, they each had different feelings. Cece's heart was filled with sweetness. She thought about when she was young, and how her young master had always muttered that giving birth was the hardest for a mother, and that giving birth to a boy or a girl was the same. Although she felt sweetness in her heart, she did not dare to show it too much in front of Wan'er. She knew that the young mistress had always been very kind to her. Furthermore, these 2 years she had wholeheartedly wanted a child, but she had always, thinking of this, Cece missed the last 2 sentences of Fan Xian's words. She carefully glanced at the young mistress, who still had her head lowered and was smiling warmly. For some reason, her heart ached and she felt sad for the young mistress. The women's thoughts were complicated, but Fan Xian held his daughter and looked closely at her. The more he looked, the more he liked her. When he had entered the room earlier, he had only cared about Cece's body and Wanner's emotions. He had not thought much of his daughter. Now that he held her and felt the softness of this little body through the cloth, he looked at the wrinkles on his daughter's forehead, and watched his daughter occasionally purse her lips. His heart grew softer and softer. This was the biggest difference between men and women. A woman had been pregnant for 10 months before giving birth to a child. They had already nurtured feelings for the child for 10 months. In addition, they had put in a lot of hard work and pain. Naturally, they had a strong, indescribable warmth toward their child. A man's feelings, on the other hand, needed to be watched, held, and experienced before they would grow stronger. Particularly for someone as busy as Fan Xian, he had not been by Cece's side when she was pregnant, so he did not have strong feelings for this child. However, as he held her, the feeling came. Fan Xian held her more and more carefully. He stared in a daze at the little girl in his arms and thought, was this my daughter? In the future she would definitely be very beautiful. In the future she would definitely be very shrewd. In the future, these tightly shut little eyes would also grow bigger and bigger, becoming more and more beautiful. After his heart softened, it gradually became sour and sweet. For some reason, Fan Xian felt his nose was a bit stuffy. This kind of feeling was too complicated. Even he didn't know what words to use to describe it. He only knew one thing. His 2 lives, which had been filled with calamities and great luck, had finally been extended in this world. In this moment he thought that even if he died on the spot, he would have left something in this world. It was different from looking at the rows of books in the Jingdo government's In Sun family. This kind of feeling was stronger, more alive, and more strangely moving. After holding for a while, Wanner, who was watching from the side, took the child under Lady Lu's guidance and Fan Xian's demonstration. She held the child in her arms with heartache. According to the rules of this world, this was still her child. This kind of heartache was real. Fan Xian smiled slightly and looked at the pity and glimmer of curiosity in his wife's eyes. Only then did he remember that his wife was not very old. Under his care, she was not much different from a young girl. However, seeing Wanner holding the child, it seemed that some of the pain in his heart had lessened slightly. He felt much better. It was already late at night. Everyone was a bit tired. However, this was the first life in the 3rd generation of the Fan Manor. Everyone was excited. Even Minister Fan did not shy away from staying in the room. He happily watched this scene and refused to rest. In the end, it was Lady Lu who said a few words and had the old nanny and wet nurse, who had been waiting outside, come in. Holding the child, she stood to the side and urged everyone to rest early. As Minister Fan was leaving, he suddenly thought of something. He prepared to call Fan Xian to the study to ask about the situation in the palace and the emperor's mood. Immediately after, he remembered that the child had been mentally and physically exhausted these days. With great difficulty there was a joyous occasion. Why disturb him? So he didn't open his mouth. On the contrary, when the 2 elders left, Fan Xian happily asked, "Father, when I was in Jiangnan I asked you to name her. What name did you give this girl?" He asked happily, but Minister Fan glanced at Lady Lu with a complicated gaze. Shortly after, he calmly said, "As a girl, there is no rush in choosing a name. First, you can just call her by a nickname." Fan Xiaohua. Fan Xian smiled and said, "You've thought of a nickname a long time ago." After these words were said, Lin Wanner and Cece were both dissatisfied. They wondered how someone of their status could have such a common name. However, Cece didn't dare open her mouth in front of everyone. Wanner noticed the old man's expression. Her heart jumped, but she didn't say anything. Fan Xian and Wanner met each other's eyes. Only then did they remember something. Their expressions did not look good. After Minister Fan and Lady Lu left, he couldn't resist shaking his head and sighing. Looking at his daughter in the old nanny's arms, he said, "Will this girl's name also have to wait for the palace to bestow it?" Hearing this, Cece jumped in fright. What kind of explanation was this? Immediately after, she thought of the young master's other identity and quickly pressed her lips together, not daring to express any opinion. Lin Wanner gazed at him and quietly said, "I heard the old master say that back then your name was also given by the palace. I think it's not just a name. At the latest, the emperor will have you bring the child into the palace the day after tomorrow. Bestowing a name is a matter. The palace will probably send a group of old nannies and wet nurses for you to choose." Fan Xian raised his eyebrows and smiled coldly. "Those old bastards in the palace, if they come, then they come. I'll just raise them alone." Now he had the confidence to speak. He was someone who dared to slap even the Empress Dowager, let alone those old fish eyeballs. However, after these words were said, the nanny in the east wing holding the baby girl became afraid. The wet nurse behind her lowered her head and didn't dare to breathe too loudly. Fan Xian glanced at them and calmly said, "I'll have to trouble you to take good care of the young lady, but there's no need for a wet nurse. Tomorrow the mistress will speak with the mistress." Lin Wan'er glanced at him with confusion. What was her husband doing? Why was he kicking out the wet nurse? She watched as Fan Xian sat back down on the bed. Smiling, he asked Cici, "Is there milk?" Cici blushed slightly and nodded. Fan Xian smiled and said, "Then it's settled. The child has to be raised by herself. What's the point of having a wet nurse nurse the child?" Fan Xian thought, how do you people know the importance of breastfeeding? How much does colostrum sell for in the world? The doctor had said that the psychological effects of a mother breastfeeding a baby. He knew that no one in the world would understand these things if he told them, so he didn't discuss it with the two women and made his decision. The wet nurse to the side lowered her head and didn't dare to say anything. She thought to herself, what's wrong with a wet nurse? The reason the Fan family was able to prosper was because the ancestors in Danzhou had nurtured a few children of the royal family. The old nanny heard something else and looked at the young master, dumbfounded. Was the young master going to let his aunt raise the young lady herself? That was against the rules. Tomorrow she would have to talk to the master and mistress about it. Fan Xian didn't know what the old woman was thinking, but he didn't care. He had worked hard in this world for 20 years. If he had to let others talk about how he raised his own daughter, then he would have lived his life in vain. He sat by Cici's side and said a few more words. He found that the girl was sleepy and forcing her eyes to stay open to talk. He couldn't bear it, so he smiled and said, "Hurry up and go to sleep. In the past when we were in Danzhou you were even lazier than me." Seeing Cici's hesitant expression, Fan Xian smiled and said, "You've been in the capital for a few years and you've become muddle-headed. When you were little I said that giving birth to a boy or a girl is the same. Although it's not a national policy, it's a family rule." When they returned to the master bedroom, a servant girl who had been rubbing her sleepy eyes brought hot water and prepared to serve the two masters to bed. Fan Xian waved his hand and shooed them out. He helped Wan'er sit on the side of the bed and looked seriously into her eyes. He said, "I know the rules of the manor. The children of the mistress have to live with the first branch." Tears swirled in Lin Wan'er's eyes, but they didn't fall. These few days she had suffered many blows. There was a lot of sorrow in her heart, but she had nowhere to pour it out. Cici had returned home today. Although she remembered that the baby girl was Fan Xian's flesh and blood and was happy in her heart and even faintly grateful to Cici, the emotions in her heart were incomparably complicated. In particular, Fan Xian faintly revealed that he didn't want her to participate. After a few mixed emotions, it made Wan'er sad uncontrollably. She was of noble birth and had a strange background. Her personality was like ice and snow. Her naivety was mixed with a hidden intelligence. In the end she was still a woman. Any woman would always have a woman's meticulous thoughts. Fan Xian looked at her calmly. He knew that the eldest princess's death, the second prince's death, and the bloodshed of the royal family had already made it difficult for his wife to bear the burden. Using the softest tone he could muster, he said, "You're thinking about it the wrong way, aren't you? I just don't want those nannies to taint our child. This child is still ours, but Cici is her birth mother. We can't just carry her over like this." Lin Wan'er sighed and gazed at her husband's face in front of her. In a quiet voice she said, "You don't have to be so careful in front of me. I know you're worried about me." She forced a smile. "However, sometimes I do feel a bit jealous. Like the things you and Cici sometimes say, I don't really understand. Something about national policy or family rules or something." Fan Xian smiled helplessly. After all, Cici had grown up with him. Just like how he used letters to educate his younger sister, there were some things that belonged to that life. He held his wife's hands and quietly said, "In the future, I'll tell you everything. Only we know. If other people want to know, I won't tell them." He paused and held his wife's hands tightly. Smiling, he said, "I'll tell you everything about carriages, bridal sedan chairs, cars and cannons." Lin Wan'er was confused. She knew about carriages and bridal sedan chairs, but what were cars and cannons? She knew he was trying to coax her, so she forcefully hid the sorrow on her face. Lowering her head slightly, she said, "I actually want a child. Looking at my brother's current situation, I don't know what will happen in the future. With a child, I'll have one more hope." These words were spoken lightly, but it made Fan Xian's heart ache, particularly as he looked at Wan'er's slightly thin face. Compared to 2 years ago, she was much thinner. Compared to Cece on the other side, it was as if she had just given birth and lost her body. He felt even more pity for her. He knew what his wife was thinking. Furthermore, the development of the medicine should be almost complete, so he had a lot of confidence. With a teasing tone he said, "Of course we have to have a child. Let's give little Hua, or a little brother. This house will be lively." Wan'er only thought he was coaxing her. She smiled and didn't say anything. Fan Xian looked at her furtively and said, "However, it seems there are many steps to having a child. Speaking of which, we haven't been intimate in more than half a year." Lin Wan'er smiled and spat at him. Shortly after, she remembered that her husband was purposely teasing her. Thinking of his kindness and attentiveness, she felt even more sorrow. Fan Xian was only joking. So many people had died in the palace. How could the husband and wife be in the mood to do such things? He stood and brought over the basin of slightly warm water. Placing it in front of the bed, he directly took off Wan'er's shoes and socks, giving her a fright. "I'll wash your feet. Running around in and out of the palace these days, you must have suffered a lot." Fan Xian lowered his head and placed his wife's bare feet into the basin. Stirring up the hot water, he gently rubbed them. Lin Wan'er looked at his hair and felt the threads of warmth coming from her feet. Her nose ached and she began to cry soundlessly. Fan Xian lowered his head. Without raising it, he knew she was crying. He knew his wife's pain, but he couldn't find any words to comfort her. He could only silently help her wash her feet. Uncontrollably, there were countless more sorrows in his heart. Chapter 589. Being a father for the first time and finding the long-lost gentleness on his wife's knees, Fan Xian slept peacefully. He didn't wake until late in the morning. In the moment he woke, there was still a satisfied smile at the corners of his lips. Opening his eyes, he found that Wan'er was no longer by his side. He guessed that she had gone to see her daughter. He couldn't help but rub his head and smile. He thought that now that he was also a father, when he did things and thought about problems, he had to be more appropriate and steady. Thinking like this, he threw the death disputes in Jingdo to the back of his mind. His mood, which had been gloomy for a long time, became a bit more cheerful. However, the sky was bright and urged him to return to the dangerous world. Fan Xian sighed and casually washed up with the help of a serving girl. He put on his official robes and entered the flower hall. He didn't want to eat properly. Carrying a bowl of bird's nest porridge, he entered the east wing and looked at his still sleeping daughter. As he ate, he joked with Wan'er and Cece. He then went to pay his respects to his father, Lady Lu, and left the manor for the royal palace. The streets of Jingdo were still filled with a somber atmosphere. However, the emperor had returned safely to the capital. The Jingdo people's moods were much more at ease. The number of people on the streets gradually increased. Fan Xian looked at this scene through the window and felt slightly at ease. Passing through the palace doors and along the long corridor, he came to the royal study. As expected, he saw the diligent emperor wearing an unlined robe and reading memorials. Fan Xian was slightly surprised. After bowing, he stood up and waited silently to the side, using his peripheral vision to sneak a look at the emperor's expression. With a glance he was shocked. He found that the corners of the emperor's lips carried an unfathomable smile. Naturally, it revealed a sense of comfort. It was completely different from the lonely appearance of the father and son of the Tian family yesterday after they had killed each other. Fan Xian was confused. He thought to himself that he had just given birth to a precious daughter, so he was happy. Where did the emperor's happiness come from? Thinking of this, Fan Xian felt even more admiration for Director Chen, who had been summoned into the palace last night. Probably only that old cripple could make the emperor so happy. It was as if he had forgotten the tragedies that had happened one after another. The emperor put down the memorial and raised his head. Looking at Fan Xian warmly, he said, "There is no court conference today. Why have you come to the palace so early?" Jingdo had just stabilized. The officials of the 6 ministries were either locked up, escaped, injured, or dead. Everything was still under the control of the military. With the imperial army as the main force and the Jingdo government as the base, they maintained the general order of Jingdo. Naturally, there was no way to hold a court conference as usual. Fan Xian felt it was strange. He thought to himself that the situation was so tense. Who knew how many things had to be taken care of in the palace? Even if the emperor wanted to immediately strip him of his position as the regent, as a close official, he had to enter the palace to share the burdens. Did he dare to close his door and live out his days in his manner? He carefully replied, "The rebel army is about to be ambushed, but there are still some uncertainties in various places. I thought about it carefully and was afraid that His Majesty would have some instructions, so I hurried to enter the palace. The emperor smiled and said, "You just gave birth to a girl, yet you don't stay a bit longer in the manor. Could it be that you really have a busy life?" Fan Xian smiled. He knew that it must have been Qin Pingping who had spoken to the emperor last night. He said, "After I'm off duty, I'll just go back to the manor and hug more. You're not an official of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. When did I put you on duty?" The emperor glared at him and said, "You still have to be so careless after giving birth. How is that like a father?" Fan Xian paused. Only now did he understand the emperor's meaning. It looked like he was preparing for him to go home and nurse his child. This was what he had hoped for. Hearing the emperor's harsh words of criticism, he felt a bit depressed in his heart. When it came to being a father, although it was his first time, he thought he would be much better than the emperor. Didn't he see what happened to Qingqian and the second prince? Thinking of the two brothers, he immediately thought of Qingqian waiting for death in the Eastern Palace while he had just given birth to a daughter. The expression on his face began to become strange. His lips moved slightly. He didn't know how to respond to the emperor's words. Perhaps the emperor saw something strange in his expression. His expression also changed slightly, but he did not give any instructions on how to deal with the matter of the rebellion. Lightly he said, "You don't have to wait in the palace today. Go back first. It's your first day as a father. You have to be careful." Pausing slightly, the emperor suddenly tilted his head as if thinking about something. A moment later he slowly said, "Tomorrow have Qin girl bring the child into the palace for me to see." Fan Xian quickly gave his thanks. He could also see that the emperor's mood had become bad again. Receiving the edict, he quickly left the royal study. As soon as he left the royal study, he was stopped by eunuch Yao. He had probably also received news of the Fan Manor's happiness and repeatedly offered his congratulations. Fan Xian didn't have time to chat much with the eunuch. He handed over a red packet but suddenly thought of something. Lowering his voice, he asked about the captured eunuchs and serving girls in the palace, as well as the aces and guards of the internal court, about how to deal with them. Although the true settling of accounts after autumn should be a matter after the situation was settled, dealing with things in the palace was always much faster than dealing with things outside. Even if they hadn't taken action yet, the emperor should have drawn up some rules. Fan Xian was worried. Taking advantage of this opportunity, he asked the eunuch close to the emperor. Although he was worried in his heart, his face did not show a glimmer of anxiety. He did his best to ask as lightly as possible, pretending to be concerned as a regent should. Eunuch Yao knew this young man's identity and knew his future power. He would not think too much and picked out a few important matters to talk about. Fan Xian had wanted to ask about the situation in the Eastern Palace. After thinking about it carefully, he closed his mouth. After bidding farewell to eunuch Yao, he was in a daze and couldn't come back to his senses for a moment. What shocked him was that the emperor had dealt with these eunuchs, serving girls, and guards so leniently. It was completely different from what he had guessed. Putting aside Hong Zhu, the head of the eunuchs who hadn't done anything on the surface, not many of the nannies in Hongguang Palace, the new eunuchs in the Eastern Palace, and the serving girls in Guangxin Palace had been killed. Most of them had kept their lives. Fan Xian shook his head and walked toward the outside of the palace. He wondered if the sun had risen from the west today. How did the emperor suddenly become such a gentle person? Suddenly his heart jumped. Thinking of the emperor's dark expression last night and his warm conversation with him earlier, he involuntarily guessed that perhaps the emperor had finally thought through some things after suffering a great shock and was beginning to accumulate good fortune for himself and the descendants of the Li family. The reality was actually not far from his guess. The emperor was not someone who killed indiscriminately or liked to kill. It was just that his personality was firm and harsh, and he did not shy away from killing. For example, the servants in the palace only listened to the Empress Dowager's orders and were not deeply involved in rebellion. Furthermore, the emperor did not care about removing weeds by the roots. Additionally, the crown prince and second prince had used their deaths to show their resistance. This made a slight change in the emperor's mentality. The next day, Fan Xian and Lin Wan'er carried the little girl into the palace. For the first time, the emperor displayed the benevolence an elder should have in front of the two of them. He held the baby girl and looked closely at her for a long time. He was in a good mood. However, when the emperor used his fingers to carefully stroke the baby girl's brows, Fan Xian's heart trembled. In Hongguang Palace, he knew how powerful the emperor's fingers were. However, the emperor seemed to like this girl very much, particularly her brows and eyes. Fan Xian looked at this scene and muttered to himself, He wondered if the emperor was beginning to remember some of the marks from the past again. As he was thinking this, the emperor had him take the child to the various palaces for the concubines to see and left Wanner behind. Fan Xian was slightly surprised but didn't say anything. He followed the order and left. Presently there was no mistress in the palace. Naturally, the reward for sending off the child could not be immediately explained. It was left to be dealt with in the future. When Lady Ning carried the child, she said she wanted the palace to send a nanny and wet nurse. However, Fan Xian firmly refused. This made Lady Ning and Yi Guipin a bit puzzled. This was supposed to be a joyous occasion, but too many people had died in the palace recently, so it was impossible to be happy. No matter how loud Lady Ning's laughter was, it could not dilute the strange atmosphere in the palace. Yi Guipin only smiled warmly. It was the third prince, Li Qingping, who had not yet recovered from his injuries, who struggled to be carried and called her little sister. The corners of Fan Xian's lips twitched slightly. He thought to himself that this kid was indeed terrifyingly precocious. However, this seniority seemed to be ridiculously wrong. For some reason he thought of his sister and Xia far away in northern Qi. The Dong Mountain matter involved 3 countries. He was certain to die. He didn't know if the 2 of them would have any problems over there. He didn't stay for long before Fan Xian withdrew with the child in his arms. He went into the royal study to pick up his wife and bid farewell to the emperor to return home. The emperor thought for a moment and then allowed it. He also said that the matter of bestowing names could be discussed later. Fan Xian knew that the emperor had been busy dealing with court affairs after the rebellion. He had not thought that he would still remember such a small matter. He couldn't help but be surprised. After leaving the palace, Fan Xian didn't ask Wanner what the emperor had kept her to say. Looking at his wife's red and swollen eyes, he knew that the conversation between his uncle and niece this time was, without a doubt, related to the deaths of the eldest princess and those 2. In the following month, under the emperor's powerful efforts, the 6 ministries, 3 departments and 3 departments of the court gradually returned to the right track. The remnants of the rebel army scattered in the wilderness were also completely wiped out. Yi Zhong led the troops back in triumph. The entire situation had stabilized. Jingdo returned to peace. The aura of the rebellion finally gradually faded. Fan Xian resigned from his position as regent early in the morning. On the night the royal entourage returned to the capital, he returned the emperor's royal seal. Although he didn't resign and no one saw him as regent anymore, no one knew whether or not these minor mistakes would lead to a major disaster in the future. Each day he was late was one more day of danger. He continued to be the commissioner of the Overwatch Council and the transport envoy of the palace treasury. He no longer had to worry about the problems in court affairs. The court affairs were managed by the 2 scholars and a group of civil officials. The military was managed by the Bureau of Military Affairs. None of them had anything to do with him. Thus, other than Yan Bingyun occasionally coming to the manor to report on an errand and Jiangnan's Su Wenmao and Xia Qifei's timely delivery of council reports, there was nothing else for him to worry about. However, there were some interludes such as how Sir Yan Jr. had survived. Fan Xian did not ask a single word. He didn't even want to go to the Overwatch Council, much less ask those annoying questions. On the contrary, it was Xia Qifei's letter that the old Ming master in Jiangnan had hanged himself after learning of the eldest princess' defeat. This made Fan Xian sigh with emotion. Ming Qingda had finally died. Thinking of how he had fought with this old man for a long time in Jiangnan and had not expected him to die like this, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel perplexed. He thought to himself that when the old man hung himself, perhaps he had used the white cloth he had given him. Perhaps it was because he had been tired by the string of matters in Jingdo, or perhaps it was because his old injuries had lingered, but Fan Xian was truly ill. After he recovered, he only stayed at home to hold his child, comfort his wife, and be filial to his old man. He hid in the little building and did not care about the north, south, east and west winds outside. He enjoyed his family and was very happy. Jingdo gradually calmed down. After the surviving officials had settled their thoughts, they began to return to their usual days of currying favor. Everyone knew that during this month, Sir Fan Jr., who had done the most in quelling the rebellion, rarely entered the palace. He only stayed at home with his child. They couldn't help but feel confused. Some people who thought they were clever thought the emperor had other thoughts. Later, news gradually came from the palace. It was said that the emperor greatly liked Sir Fan Jr.'s little girl. Even allowing Sir Fan Jr. to rest for a month was the emperor's grace. Thus, everyone knew what they had to do. The Empress Dowager had just passed away, and all of Jingdo had turned white. In accordance with etiquette, All entertainment and pastimes had been stopped, and the restaurants had to be closed for a month. The Fan Manor had a joyous occasion, so they could not make a big fuss. They didn't even hang a single red lantern outside the door. No matter how one looked at it, one could not see the joyous atmosphere. Every day at dusk, there would always be some officials sneaking into the Fan Manor, leaving behind gifts and leaving without a word. The Fan father and son quietly accepted the gifts. As for the matters the officials had entrusted them with, they couldn't be bothered to pay attention to them. They knew why, in such a serious and tense time, those officials still took the risk to send gifts and use connections. After putting down the rebellion, a large number of the officials who usually followed the Crown Prince, the Second Prince and the eldest princess had been taken down and locked up in the Overwatch Council's prison. Some of the officials who did not have a firm enough stance in the Jingdo matter had been chased out of the Yamen by the emperor with a stroke of his pen. In all of the 6 ministries including Dongshan Road and Jiangnan Road in the east, there were suddenly hundreds of empty spots. Cats loved fish, dogs loved poop and officials loved positions. These hundreds of positions made their eyes red. How could they care too much? There had been too many changes in the palace. Many of the old connections had been cut off. Most of the people had no connection to the Dingzhou army, so no one dared to give gifts to the cold-faced great prince. Coincidentally, Sir Fan Jr. had given birth to a daughter, giving them a great opportunity to give gifts. They could not pass it up. After a month, Jingdo was finally settled. The Hall of Governmental Affairs drew up a list of the vacated positions in the various ministries, temples and courtyards, as well as the east and south roads. They filled in many of the candidates from the spring examinations. Most of them could be considered good and capable people. The officials whose names were written were overjoyed. They thought it was the gifts they had given to the Fan Manor that had worked. Those who were not chosen were secretly angry. The silver they had prepared at home was too little. Sir Fan Jr. indeed did not like it. That day Fan Xian held the child. As he lowered his head to play with the little girl's soft red lips, he said to his father, "I didn't say a word." Minister Fan drank a mouthful of sour berries and said with a slight smile, "I'm about to resign. Who has the patience to go into the palace to say it?" Xiaohua Xiaohua. Fan Xian smiled at his father and then lowered his head to coax the child. During this month he had held the girl every day. He truly loved her more and more. Minister Fan glanced at him and suddenly said, "Although the emperor has an edict for you to rest, you've already rested for a month. You haven't gone to the Overwatch Council Yamen for a single day. What exactly are you hiding from?" Fan Jian's heart jumped. He was afraid that his father would see through his thoughts. He smiled and said, "When I can hide, I should hide. After marrying Wanner, other than when I was injured in the Hanging Temple, I haven't had such leisure days." When he mentioned the Hanging Temple, the corner of his mouth trembled slightly, but his father did not notice. During this month, he had hidden in the manor and refused to go to the Overwatch Council for one reason. He was very afraid of running into Qin Pingping. If he did run into Qin Pingping, he was afraid he wouldn't be able to resist asking him some things to confirm certain things. Although the old cripple would still choose to remain silent and separate out of love for him, if the old and young actually met, how would they interact? There were many things the emperor did not understand, but Fan Xian gradually saw them clearly. The clearer he saw, the colder his heart became and the more worried he became. Just like this, a few days of leisure passed. Autumn grew stronger in Jingdo and the weather grew colder and colder. Jingdo grew more and more stable and the palace grew more and more peaceful. Most of the eunuchs and serving girls had survived and continued to serve people. Eunuch Dai, who had been reinstated, secretly sent out a message saying that some of the people Sir Fan Jr. asked about were alive and some were dead. He was very moved and said that only Sir Fan Jr. would care for these pitiful people like this. He then thought of how he had been in the past and so on. Asking for a few names was actually just a pretense. Fan Xian only wanted to confirm Hongzhu's punishment. However, the other news eunuch Dai spoke of made his expression freeze. Tomorrow the palace was going to issue an edict. Fan Xian was well aware of the contents of the edict. The emperor's goal in offering sacrifices to heaven was to depose the crown prince. This edict had finally been issued. It only proved one thing. The person in the eastern palace had perhaps that person had already left for many days. No one knew. Fan Xian lowered his head and drank his tea. He did not say a word. There was no sorrow on his face. It was so calm it made one's heart palpitate. Lin Wanner watched his expression from the side and knew what he was thinking about. Carefully she asked, "What's wrong?" "Tomorrow I'm going into the palace," Fan Xian said quietly to her. There are some things I need to report to the emperor. Lin Wanner gazed at him worriedly. Fan Xian comforted her and said, It's nothing big. I just promised someone something. There were 340 Jingdo officials involved in the rebellion. Adding on their subordinates, trusted aides and family members, the emperor had captured 4,000 people. The Overwatch Council's prison had long been full. The Ministry of Justice and Supreme Court were also stuffed full of people. In the end, even the Western Academy of the Imperial College had been moved out to be used to lock up criminals. According to Qing law, those who rebelled would have their entire family executed. Even if there were cases of mercy outside of the law, it would probably still cost 2,000 or 3,000 heads. Fan Xian smiled bitterly and shook his head. He thought to himself, if it was the him of the past, perhaps these 2,000 or 3,000 heads would have fallen. What did it have to do with him? However, having lived to this day, he had long understood some principles. At least, he had to do what he promised someone. Furthermore, looking at the situation this month, the emperor's actions were becoming gentler and gentler. Fan Xian had some confidence that at least a few of those women and children would be able to live. Putting aside whether it was a blessing or not, just the crown prince's surrender had allowed the Qing kingdom's soldiers to live a few thousand more. Fan Xian had to repay this thought. Early the next morning, Fan Xian tidied up his official robes. A thought occurred to him. He turned around and picked up a piece of cloth to put in his clothes. This piece of cloth had Fan Xiaohua's red footprints on it when she was 1 month old. At the time, everyone in the manor had felt that Fan Xian's actions were strange. They had not thought that he was just reminiscing about the customs of many years ago. Now he was taking this piece of cloth to prepare to attack the emperor's heart. Once he was ready, he climbed into the carriage. Unexpectedly, he saw the familiar person across the street smiling at him. Fan Xian lowered his head to look at his black Overwatch Council robes and then at the pure white clothing the person wore. In a low voice he said, I said I won't go, so I won't go. Even if you come every day pretending to be white impermanence and pull me, I still won't go. Yan Bingyun walked over with a slight smile on his cold face. This is the director's intention. As a subordinate, I can only come and bother you every day. Are you going to enter the palace? Since you can enter the palace, you have to return to the council to handle council affairs. There's no need to wait for the director to go to the palace to ask for an edict. Fan Xian spat on the ground and suddenly thought of the matter of entering the palace. Furrowing his brows, he said a few words in a low voice beside Yan Bingyun's ear. Yan Bingyun looked at him with slight surprise. He thought that everyone had the right to punish traitors. Additionally, this matter was carried out according to Qing law. The emperor had not done anything overboard. Why did the commissioner have to enter the palace to admonish? He looked at Fan Xian like he was looking at a monster. Shaking his head, he said, the council did not randomly capture people. Those people were definitely not wronged. I do not understand when your heart became so gentle. Chapter 590. How come you have time to come into the palace to see me today? The emperor raised his head and glanced at Fan Xian with a smile. There was a glimmer of mockery in his warm gaze. It looked like after a month the emperor's mood had calmed down a great deal. For no reason, a glimmer of fear rose in Fan Xian's heart. He forced a smile and was speechless. Although this month's leave had been personally given by the emperor, not entering the palace for an entire month and not seeing the emperor was indeed inexcusable. Clearly hearing the emperor's displeasure, he didn't know how to respond. He didn't enter the palace because of the glimmer of coldness and fear in his heart. Ever since he knew the emperor was a great grandmaster, Fan Xian, who had always been daring, finally understood what fear was. Particularly, the emperor's silence and tolerance these few days made him even more wary. If possible, he would rather never enter the royal palace again and never see the emperor's face again. The gentler he was, the more afraid he was. He swallowed a mouthful of saliva to moisten his dry throat. In a low voice, he sincerely spoke of the matter he had come to the palace to ask for. However, he didn't mention Crown Prince Li Qingxian's name. He only discussed the matter as it stood and urged the emperor to be merciful when dealing with the matter of the rebellion. The victor was always tolerant. The emperor, who had lost a large number of his family members, was becoming more and more lenient. Fan Xian thought to himself. Furthermore, he was confident that someone as powerful as the emperor would not worry about the problem of a new life coming with the spring wind. Unexpectedly, the emperor's expression gradually darkened. It was as if he had not thought that Fan Xian would ask for such a thing on his rare visit to the palace. A thick coldness flashed through his eyes. Fan Xian secretly glanced at the emperor's gaze and thought to himself that things were going to be bad. Even if things were going to be bad, he still stubbornly persisted. It was not only because of what Li Qingqian had asked before his death. This also concerned his own courage. If it wasn't for this matter that made him find a glimmer of courage, he probably wouldn't have dared to enter the palace again. Thus he had to persist. It was because of this persistence that the royal study appeared very lively and terrifying. Eunuch Yao and the other eunuchs on duty outside the royal study paled in fright at the angry cursing coming from inside the room. They didn't know what Sir Fan Jr. had done to make the emperor so angry. Everyone listened nervously and fearfully outside the royal study. It was the sound of teacups crashing to the ground and bones shattering. Then it was the sound of Sir Fan Jr. kowtowing, the emperor's cursing, and the sound of two people arguing. Eunuch Yao's expression did not change, but huge waves rolled in his heart. He thought to himself that Sir Fan Jr. was indeed daring to go head-to-head with the emperor. He couldn't help but worry about what would happen in a moment. He carefully stared at the door and wondered if he should quickly notify the two scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. So many people had died in the royal palace. Of the people alive, there were only a few who had the right to mediate the dispute between the emperor and the Duke of Dambois. Before long, the two doors to the royal study were pushed open with a squeak. Fan Xian walked out with quick steps. His face carried an expression of anger and indignation. He didn't even glance at the eunuchs with their heads lowered outside. With a wave of his sleeves, he left the royal palace. Once he left the palace and got into the carriage, the anger and indignation on his face immediately disappeared. There was calm and slight worry between his brows. Of course, the emperor had severely reprimanded Fan Xian. No emperor, even those who were known to be the most benevolent, would have a sliver of sympathy for enemies who dared to plot for power in the world. Fan Xian should have thought this through clearly. He just didn't understand why the emperor still wanted to fight like this. After returning to his manor for a few days, there was still no news from the palace. There was also no edict to reprimand him. Fan Xian felt more and more uneasy. He thought that the emperor had probably guessed his intentions and had played a dirty trick on him. However, he had no other choice. He could only use his identity as the commissioner of the Overwatch Council to write a few secret memorials and continuously send them into the palace in an attempt to anger the emperor again. Unexpectedly, these secret memorials were like meat buns and big dogs. Clay Bodhisat was entering the river. There was not a single response. After a few more days, the palace finally settled on how to deal with the matter of rebellion. Fan Xian held the edict in his manor and felt greatly shocked and surprised. He had not thought that after his argument with the emperor in the royal study, the emperor would actually listen to him and raise the butcher's knife high only to gently bring it down. Among the captured rebel officials as well as some people who had not been released, there were over 1,000 people sentenced to death by beheading. The women and children who had been implicated in the matter were basically dealt with lightly. Even for the rebel soldiers who had surrendered in the end, the emperor only chose generals of a certain rank and above to be killed. As for the common soldiers, they were scattered and sent to the various borders to fight for the country as prisoners on death row, with the intention of atoning for their crimes by performing meritorious deeds. In the end, it was calculated that about 2,000 people had died because of the rebellion. This had already greatly exceeded Fan Xian's best judgment, particularly the families of the officials who had committed crimes according to Qing law. Most of them had been demoted a rank and dealt with. This made his mood very good. While he was very good, he was also confused. Why did the emperor do this? If it was truly because of the effect of his remonstrance, why did he have such a big temper in the royal study that day? The conflict between the emperor and Sir Fan Jr. in the royal study had long shocked the entire Jingdo. After all, there were many people in the palace, and it was impossible to hide this matter from everyone. Long before the emperor made the edict, most of the officials knew the inside story of this matter. Although the officials all had their own camps, they all knew that if the crown prince took the throne, it would probably be difficult for them to escape death. After all, they had all been officials in the same court for many years. There was always a sorrowful feeling of things hurting their own kind, particularly those innocent family members implicated in this matter. Thus, when they saw the emperor's extremely benevolent edict, they all sighed with emotion. In particular, the two leading scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs were full of praise for the emperor's edict. From the depths of their hearts, they praised the emperor endlessly. A benevolent ruler was the foundation of the world. Zhuang Mohan's disciples and grand-disciples deeply agreed. Why was the emperor so benevolent? Of course it was because of Sir Fan Jr. Sir Fan Jr. disregarded his personal honor and power and bravely admonished the emperor in the royal study. Although it was not to the extent of gambling with his entire family's life, he had still taken a considerable risk. Thinking of this matter, the Jingdo court couldn't help but regard Fan Xian even more highly. They felt that he was indeed worthy of being Master Zhuang's successor. His way of doing things was very old-fashioned. Those who had luckily escaped death were all secretly grateful to Fan Xian. For a moment, Fan Xian's clean name once again rang out in Jingdo. Back then he had always been the idol in the hearts of the scholars. However, because of his identity in the Overwatch Council, as well as the palace's wariness of Prime Minister Lin, he had gradually pulled away from the clear stream. However, his reputation among the people was still very good. Furthermore, after this incident, the officials also felt great admiration for him. After all, not everyone dared to go against the emperor, particularly when it concerned a rebellion. Even Xu Wu the scholar maintained his silence. Fan Xian had not thought that this matter would bring him so many benefits. Originally, he had only wanted to return some of Li Qingxian's kindness and at the same time, anger the emperor to see if he could make his father, whom he feared so much, show some kindness and let him go. Unexpectedly, the emperor had long seen through his thoughts and played such a trick to raise Fan Xian up again. Even if he wanted to resign, it would be impossible. Fan Xian's face was heavy in the manner as he looked at his daughter. He thought to himself that he had indeed become much lazier with the emperor. However, he still didn't understand why the emperor had given him such glory with both hands. After thinking about it, he felt a bit annoyed. He slammed the table and stood up. Gritting his teeth, he said, "I even dare to enter the palace to see the emperor. Would I be afraid of seeing him?" Fan Xiao's eyes were tightly shut, but she did not cry in fright from the loud noise. It was Wanner and Cece who were beside her, who jumped in fright. They didn't know why he was so angry and quickly took the child. After the Jingdo rebellion, the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian, returned to the Overwatch Council for the first time. All of his subordinates bowed respectfully to welcome him. Their expressions were serious. Through the countless things that had happened these few years, the entire Overwatch Council had completely accepted this future director and were deeply awed by his methods. Fan Xian sat in the dark room and wiped his hands with a wet towel. Pulling back the black cloth, he glanced at the royal palace not far away and shook his head. Qin Pingping was not here, but he could not immediately go to Qin Garden. He summoned a few leaders of the 8 bureaus and asked about the recent situation. He then had Yan Bingyun stay. Hearing his question, Yan Bingyun shook his head and said, "There is still no news of Sir Wang. As for Hong Changqing's group, a few people have returned, but he himself has disappeared. The 7 Tiger Guards Gao de Brat should have all been killed by Sigu Jian on Dong Mountain." Fan Xian's brows gradually furrowed. He felt very uncomfortable in his heart. Logically speaking, Wang Qinian was so cunning. How could he have quietly died on Dong Mountain? Even if a battle between great grandmasters was terrifying, there had to be a corpse. The Overwatch Council knew that Wang Qinian was his most trusted aide, so they shouldn't have missed it. As for Hong Changqing and Gauda, he had no confidence at all. He thought that they had probably really gone. Thinking of this, his mood immediately became gloomy. He didn't linger in the Overwatch Council. Getting into the carriage, he headed straight out of Jingdo and toward Qin Garden. Between the green meadows outside Qin Garden, the usual murderous traps were no longer there. Fan Xian sat in the carriage and thought that the Qin family must have sent the Jingdo garrison to clean them out. After the carriage stopped outside Qin Garden, Fan Xian disembarked and looked at the scene in front of him. He couldn't help but freeze. This was no longer the once beautiful and unique Qin Garden. All he saw were broken walls and ruins, dry ponds and shattered mountains, drooping willows and traces of fire and smoke. It was a wretched sight. Qin Garden had been burned down, leaving behind a mess. However, it was not too desolate at the moment, because a few temporary houses made of bricks and wood had already been built at the back. Moreover, there were already over 1,000 craftsmen busying themselves on the original site. It looked like a bustling construction site. Fan Xian walked through the construction site with great difficulty. With great difficulty, he came to the back of Qin Garden and found Qin Pingping, who was being served by a dozen beautiful female attendants and listening to an opera. This old dog was dressed like a landlord. He sat on a low couch with narrowed eyes in enjoyment. His feet were covered by a blanket. Although it was noisy outside and this temporary residence was far from comfortable, looking at his expression he was very happy. The sound of stone being cut and bricks being laid outside completely suppressed the sounds of the opera inside. Fan Xian walked in and furrowed his brows. How can I hear this clearly? It's not like you don't have a house in the capital. Why must you stay here? It will take at least 3 months for Qin Garden to be completely repaired. Are you going to spend 3 months here? Seeing him walk in, Qin Pingping smiled. His smile made his wrinkles bloom like a chrysanthemum flower. Each petal was filled with a strange aura. Fan Xian's hair stood on end because of this smile. He didn't speak. He sat by his side and picked up a teacup to take a sip. The beautiful female attendants who had been glued to Qin Pingping's side knew that the little duke had come today to say something important. They did not look at Fan Xian lovingly like they usually did. Restraining their voices and calming their spirits, they withdrew. Outside there were probably Overwatch Council officials giving orders. Even the sounds of repairing the garden had stopped. The ruins in front and behind Qin Garden all sank into silence. Qin Pingping glanced at him. Fan Xian moved closer and used the teacup in his hand to feed him a sip. Qin Pingping moistened his throat before saying, "It is not easy to live in Jingdo. It is better to live in this rundown garden." It was not easy to live in Jingdo. This was his reply to Fan Xian's deliberately natural words earlier, but there seemed to be some other meaning hidden within. Fan Xian immediately became unnatural. He knew that this old cripple knew that he had come today because he had something to ask of him. Without waiting for Fan Xian to speak, Qin Pingping opened his mouth and said, "There are countless beauties in my garden. You know that?" Fan Xian nodded. Qin Pingping coughed and then continued, "I take them in. They don't have to serve other stinky men. It should be considered a blessing. However, they follow a lonely old man like me every day." Then he slowly said, "He finally understood after so many people died. It's not in vain that I've spent so many years of effort." Fan Xian's lips trembled slightly. He suddenly rose and looked at Qin Pingping. "What about the third prince?" "The third prince, he is after all still young." Qin Pingping lowered his eyes slightly. "The emperor will not make a crown prince. However, if something happens and he leaves too early, choosing you to succeed is, of course, the best choice right now. My surname is Fan. I paid respects to the ancestors of the Fan family." Fan Xian's angry voice grew louder and louder. Qin Pingping glanced outside and furrowed his brows. "Why are you so loud? Not everything in this world can be justified by sound alone. Whoever has the biggest fist is justified. The emperor's fist is the biggest. As for whether your surname is Li or Fan in the future, isn't it all up to him?" Fan Xian sat down dejectedly. He had no idea that there was such a big matter hidden behind the emperor's recent warmth and benevolence. Given the emperor's present state, this matter may only happen after many years. Perhaps when the third prince grows up, the emperor will like him more than you. This matter will disappear with the wind. In any case, other than the emperor, you and me, no one else will know. Qin Pingping seemed to have thought of something. His expression dimmed slightly. He looked at Fan Xian for a moment and then said, "You haven't entered the palace for a month. It seems you have some opinions about the emperor. Why are you hiding?" Why did he hide from the emperor? It was because of the fear in his heart. Fan Xian faintly said, "I'm afraid." "What are you afraid of?" Qin Pingping looked at him and slowly said, "It's already been 4 years. You've already proven your loyalty to the emperor and obtained a rare trust. This was obtained at the price of almost dying a few times. You should confidently enjoy this kind of trust." Fan Xian was silent. After he entered the capital from Danzhou, he had indeed almost lost his life a few times. Regardless of whether it was the Hanging Temple, the Valley, or the Dong Mountain incident, no matter how he looked at it, the emperor did not suspect him at all. The reason the emperor trusted Qin Pingping so much was because Qin Pingping had once risked his life to save the emperor's life a few times. What kind of trust was the most solid? Naturally, it was to sacrifice himself for the emperor. Regardless of other matters, just based on the emperor's attitude toward you, it can be said that it is not bad. Think carefully about these years. The emperor has shown you a lot of favor. You should be grateful. Other matters? Fan Xian heard these words and didn't think too deeply about it. He thought about the palace treasury, the Overwatch Council, and the power and trust in his hands. Compared to the crown prince and the second prince, Fan Xian knew that the emperor's treatment of him was not as simple as making up for the regret of not seeing him for 16 years. Since ancient times, the emperor's family was heartless. Furthermore, he was only an illegitimate child. The emperor had many ways to understand what had happened many years ago, but he had chosen the path that was best for Fan Xian. That is why I don't understand what you are afraid of. Why you don't want to enter the palace. Why do you think of a way to escape? Qin Pingping looked at him and said. Fan Xian forced a smile. No matter how much the emperor trusted him and pampered him, he was, in the end, an emperor. Putting aside the matter of decades ago, just his cold-blooded attitude toward the members of the royal family and his incomparably powerful methods made him feel incomparably terrified. Once the emperor knew that he had hidden many things from him and even betrayed him, he would unyieldingly tear apart the father-son relationship and the righteousness of a ruler and official. Ever since he knew that the emperor was a great grandmaster, Fan Xian had begun to worry about one thing. Back then he had once secretly snuck into the royal palace and stolen the key from Hongguang Palace. If the emperor had sensed this at the time and had endured it until now, what exactly was he thinking? It didn't matter if he smuggled with Northern Qi or took in 13th Wang. The confident emperor did not care about these things at all and would not suspect Fan Xian of treason. However, he would not allow anyone to hold that chest in their hands because that chest could threaten him. Fan Xian was certain of this, but he was not sure whether or not the emperor knew the chest was in his hands. There was a letter missing from the secret compartment under the bed in Hongguang Palace. Could the emperor have taken it? That was why he was terrified the moment he entered the palace. He didn't know where a large group of aces would appear to kill him. He was also worried that the emperor would take action and use the realm of a great grandmaster to smash him into mincemeat. Chapter 591. Yesterday I made a series of mistakes. First, I wrote in a hurry resulting in too many typos. Then, when I was editing, I changed the content to the vote solicitation chapter. Fortunately, a book friend reminded me on QQ. Only then did I understand. This is a very annoying matter. As for being accused of changing it to be pretentious, it also made me angry for a while. If this was pretentious, then if I made a mistake in the vote solicitation, wouldn't that make me a fake A? I took a deep breath and immediately forgot about you. The world is so beautiful, I will not be irritable. The vote solicitation chapter had long been deleted yesterday. Now I can only continue to solicit monthly votes. As the saying goes, sending off a comrade, soliciting monthly votes. Speechless, 2 lines of tears. Third is about to be lost. Friends, please cast monthly votes to support Old Cat. Regardless of whether Fan Xian was afraid or not, the matter had already happened. However, during these years, perhaps the emperor did not want to completely break off relations with the son he admired the most because of this matter. Or perhaps the emperor only knew Fan Xian had entered the palace but did not think the chest was in Fan Xian's hands. Thus he remained silent. It seemed that this was some kind of tacit agreement not to pursue the matter to express a father's indulgence toward his favorite son. Furthermore, Fan Xian was indeed ruthless to himself. Even when faced with a desperate situation, he rarely used that powerful weapon. The only time he had used it was in an uninhabited primitive mountain forest. Additionally, the key in Hongguang Palace's secret compartment was still there, making the emperor guess some things incorrectly. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and sank into deep thought. He thought of the snow-like leaflets and how he had entered the palace to eavesdrop on the conversation between the eldest princess and Zhuang Mohan. His heart immediately relaxed. He understood that the emperor must have thought he was only targeting the eldest princess, entering the palace to eavesdrop, and not for the key. But what about the letter? Fan Xian still could not understand. Tiredly, he sat on the side of the bed in silence. In reality, other than the matter of the chest possibly being exposed, his fear of the emperor was also because of another puzzle. This was a problem that troubled Fan Xian. Regardless of whether he accepted it or not, no matter what, the emperor was still one of his fathers, although he was certainly not the best one. In Fan Xian's heart he had 3 fathers. Minister Fan was his closest biological father, and Qin Pingping could be considered a godfather. However, the emperor's figure was also gradually invading his thoughts. Qin Pingping's words interrupted his train of thought. If you didn't enter the palace because you were afraid, then why didn't you return to the Overwatch Council and see me? Don't tell me you're afraid of me too. Looking at the old cripple's smiling appearance, Fan Xian sighed in his heart and thought, isn't he also afraid? I'm just afraid that after seeing you, I won't be able to resist asking some questions. Although he was afraid, he still opened his mouth to ask. Since he had the courage to come, he was naturally prepared. He did not want to be a pitiful zergling that was kept in the dark. How did Yan Xiaoyi's trusted soldiers get to Dong Mountain? Why didn't the Overwatch Council have any intelligence? Why was the situation in Jingdo so dangerous? Why was there no news of the unusual movements of the officials of Dongshan Road? Why didn't you return to Jingdo and allow the eldest princess and Empress Dowager to torment you until you finally tormented yourself to death? This is the plan that His Majesty and I came up with. Of course we have to hide it from the world. Qin Pingping glanced at him coldly and said, if I didn't show weakness first, how could these people jump out? Fan Xian shook his head. Don't lie to me. I know you can certainly give the emperor a good explanation after this. Only you and I know that these people were forced by us to oppose the emperor. Furthermore, you know that although the emperor appears to have achieved great success this time, he is actually walking on a tightrope. The slightest bit of carelessness would cause him to fall into the bottomless abyss. Since you knew about this long ago, you must have the ability to make this situation better and not let Jingdo sink into a situation of eternal damnation. The emperor trusts you, but that doesn't mean I trust you. Fan Xian stared at Qin Pingping's old face and lowered his voice. This is the emperor's plan, but you've been going along with it. Although you've only pushed it a little, it has increased the danger the Qin kingdom faces by 10 times or even 100 times. Even if you want to get rid of internal trouble, you can't have so many people die. No matter how ruthless the emperor is, presumably, he wouldn't want to see this final situation. There are dogs in the world who would chase them. After a long silence, Qin Pingping said, if you want to beat the dogs, you have to beat them all to death. I'm afraid the emperor's heart will soften for a moment. Does this explanation make sense? It doesn't. Fan Xian shifted in his direction and held his thin hand. In a heavy voice he said, even if it makes sense logically, the emperor's heart will not be comfortable, particularly if he thinks about it later. There will always be problems. What problems could there be? This is the emperor's grand plan. I am just an executor. Qin Pingping very naturally pulled his hand out of Fan Xian's and coldly said, don't think too much. There aren't too many complicated things in this world. There aren't? Fan Xian's heart was filled with worry and anger. He stared into his eyes and said, then tell me, why did you have the shadow assassinate the emperor at the Hanging Temple? Why did the old Qin master's body have an additional wound on the back of his waist? Qin Pingping slowly raised his head and furrowed his brows as he looked at Fan Xian. You went to see the body? Fan Xian nodded and said, I know that was the shadow's attack. He paused and then smiled bitterly. However, since I saw it, naturally there is no wound now. I didn't think you would be so meticulous, Qin Pingping said. Qin Pingping said, I was the one who ordered the shadow to attack in the floating temple. You can report me to the king now. But you should know that the shadow has 2 mysterious identities. Aside from you and me, no one else knows this. Not even the king knows. Qin Pingping nodded. Fan Xian angrily said, even so, you still won't say it? Say what? Why did the old Qin master betray the emperor? This was the question the eldest princess had Fan Xian asked Qin Pingping before she died. Now he finally bravely asked. Betrayal never needs a reason. Qin Pingping was as cold and severe as ever. You had the shadow kill Qin Yi. Were you afraid I would find out something from his mouth? Qin Pingping laughed coldly and couldn't be bothered to reply. He waved his hand to signal for the guest to leave. Fan Xian stared at him coldly. A moment later, his gaze helplessly softened. Using a pleading tone, he said, I know you are afraid of dragging me down, which is why you want to separate. However, such a major matter, you have to think about yourself. Qin Pingping's heart was filled with tenderness, but his face did not show it. You're thinking too much. Fan Xian was silent and speechless. Although Qin Pingping still refused to admit it, he knew from the other party's attitude that his guess was certainly correct. The Qin family must have participated in the Taiping courtyard matter. The reason for their betrayal was because of his rise. What kind of person was the old Qin master? Although he was old, he knew that if the emperor truly wanted to use Fan Xian, he would have to clean up the matter of the past. The Qin family must have died, so the Qin family must have rebelled. This was the logic. However, behind this logic was a bloody and sinister reality. Fan Xian stood and gazed at Qin Pingping in silence for a moment. He then said, after all, they are my father and mother. You've already worked hard for so many years. You should think about yourself more. I don't have many years left. You've said it yourself. Qin Pingping smiled. Fan Xian gazed at him with some bitterness and said, no one can defeat him. Qin Pingping was silent. Fan Xian prepared to leave when he suddenly said, the chest is in my hands. Qin Pingping abruptly raised his head and saw that the young man had already walked resolutely out the door. He couldn't help but shake his head. Seeing the last of Prime Minister Lin's people jump out, even if they can't do anything now, how can they have a chance to turn things around in the future? External enemies and internal troubles have all been eliminated. He has also chopped off half of our arms. Fan Jian sighed. The emperor can truly be said to be wise and mighty. He has exceptional talent in his heart. It must be admitted, just like when we began to follow him many years ago. Qin Pingping closed his eyes and slowly said, he is, and will be the most powerful person in the world. After a death-like silence, Minister Fan sighed and said, I hid in King Jing's manor in Jingdo because I was not worried about the situation in Jingdo. I had long seen that there was a problem with the Yi family. However, I had not thought that the emperor was actually a great grandmaster. I had somewhat guessed at the emperor's unfathomable power, Qin Pingping said coldly. However, I had not thought that Yi Luyun, that strange old creature, would suddenly stand on the emperor's side. The two of us only guessed one side of the emperor if... Minister Fan suddenly stopped talking. Qin Pingping knew what his old comrade was about to say and calmly said, there is no if. After that matter you were never willing to believe me and I was never willing to believe you. I never thought that the person I should have trusted the most might have had some problems. And Ji once said something, Minister Fan said. Minister Fan said, if you and I had more trust in each other, perhaps things would have been much easier. It was at that time that I knew this son of mine was extraordinary. We hid it so well, yet he was still able to guess this matter. He is the son of Xiao Yi and the emperor. Of course he is extraordinary. Qin Pingping furrowed his brows. In his heart, he still had the highest respect and admiration for the emperor. When did you guess that the emperor was a great grandmaster? Minister Fan's heart was very light as he casually asked. It's been a few years. Qin Pingping's brows gradually relaxed as he thought of the events of the past. At that time, the Wei kingdom was still standing in the center of the land. The power of the country was very powerful. When the Qin kingdom first went on a northern expedition, the battle was very difficult, particularly in one battle. At the time, the emperor, who was still the crown prince, was heavily injured. His entire body was stiff and unable to move, and he almost lost his life. It was all thanks to Qin Pingping risking his life and going through many hardships to save him. This was one of Qin Pingping's most famous deeds. It was as famous as the Thousand Li surprise attack and the capture of Xiao En at the price of a broken leg. Minister Fan furrowed his brows and said, what's wrong with that? We old people always thought that it was after that heavy injury that the emperor lost his martial arts. Fan Jian looked at him quietly and didn't say anything. He walked out of the manor. Behind him, the old servant pushed the wheelchair and followed. They didn't walk very far. In front of the construction site, the two of them stopped, looked at each other, and bowed. I've thought it through, Qin Pingping said to Fan Jian. Fan Jian didn't immediately reply. Instead, he lowered his head and thought for a moment. He didn't know if these words were true or false. He knew why Qin Pingping had come to see him off. Many years ago, they had once gone to the shores of the East Sea and gathered together in Taiping Courtyard. They had once created a great situation. However, as time passed, some people had died, some people had changed, and some people had to retreat. He had resigned and returned to Danzhou. Only Qin Pingping was left in Jingdo to accompany the emperor. Presumably he should also feel lonely. Just as Fan Xian said, during these dozen years he and Qin Pingping had suspected each other. Their interactions had gradually decreased, but it could not erase the comradeship of the past. When it was time to withdraw from the stage, it had to be completely withdrawn. Back then Lin Ruofu was not a member of the three-man group, so his withdrawal was not thorough enough. Minister Fan would not make this mistake. In front of the emperor's might, other than retiring, they did not seem to have any good choice. Before Fan Jian left, he furrowed his brows and asked one last question. He did not avoid the old servant. Since you suspected me back then, why did you have Wu Zhu take him to Danzhou? Qin Pingping sat in the wheelchair and lowered his head for a moment. He then slowly replied, because I know you once paid a price for it, so I want to continue to see your heart. A self-mocking and sad smile rose to the corners of Fan Jian's lips. He waved his hand and didn't say anything more. Watching Fan Jian's departing figure, Qin Pingping gently leaned against the wheelchair. His finger unconsciously tapped against the armrest of the wheelchair. He sighed and quietly said, "It's good that he's gone, it's good that he's gone." Immediately after, the leader of the Qin kingdom's darkness said gloomily to himself, "In the end he is his father. How could I bear to force him?" The old servant silently pushed the wheelchair back and listened to the old director say tiredly, "Tell me, why is it so difficult for someone to die?" Qin Pingping had done countless earth-shattering things in his life and faced countless dangers and hardships, but he had never been as disappointed as he was today. The enemy he faced was, without question, the most powerful person he had ever met in his life. Furthermore, that person could not find any weakness. The old servant said in a raspy voice, "It shouldn't implicate the Duke." He could already see the heaviness in his master's heart, so he did his best to ease it. "Even if the Emperor can find something after the Hanging Temple and in Little Snow Valley, I have already caused Enji to almost lose his life twice. Is this still not enough to sever my relationship with him? Enji's luck has always been good. The Emperor will certainly not suspect him. Let's just let this matter rest." Qin Pingping was slightly afraid of the cold and pulled the blanket closer to his body. Fan Jian was ready to leave, Qin Pingping had given up, and Fan Xian had thought it through. The biggest problem in the world seemed to have been solved. However, all three of them knew that if there were no major disturbances in the future, then this pot of boiling oil could be safely covered by the lid. But if something were to happen, the oil would jump out and burn everything cleanly, not to mention the fact that the boiling oil was in their hearts, and it would burn them to the point where they hissed in pain. Fortunately, a large, soft robe was draped over the great grandmaster's body, preventing the disciples who were serving him from feeling any more sorrowful. Since early in the morning, there had been an endless stream of people coming from Shangjing. The various nobles and officials all wore the etiquette of a disciple to pay their respects. After seeing Master Ku He, they knew that this should be the last time they would see the imperial advisor. The second disciple, Mu Peng, who had not been able to rest in peace even before his death, had been nervously adjusting his master's breathing. The expression on his face was somewhat vicious, but he could not say anything. The summons before his death was an order from Master Ku He. Each person only saw a moment. It was only when they saw the Grand Tutor that Ku He said a few more words. Ku He had protected this country for decades. Today he was going to leave. Even though he understood life and death, there was still something he could not let go of: this country. Today was his final farewell to this country and his final account. Regardless of whether the Grandmaster died or not, his words would certainly have a great influence on this country. Thus, he wanted to use his last moments to say a few words to these officials who controlled the Northern Qi court. He wanted to lay a more stable foundation for the emperor's future governance. Ku He looked at the military general in front of him and unconsciously sank into some kind of deep thought. There was nothing wrong with the emperor's ability. It was just that he was still young. Although Xinzhong had been executed and Shang Shanhu had submitted, if he truly died, would he be able to control the power of the military? The military general was the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs. After receiving a few words from the imperial advisor, he didn't hear any sound. He couldn't help but raise his head in fear to glance. In Northern Qi, regardless of whether it was the royal family or the generals, they all had boundless respect for Master Ku He. Ku He was different from the Qin kingdom's Yi Luyun. From the beginning, he had spread his influence and power into every crevice in the Northern Qi court. The second disciple of Tianyi Dao, Mu Peng, moved closer to his teacher's ear and quietly said, "The Emperor and Empress Dowager have both arrived. Should we call them in?" In the entire world, only Ku He had the right to call the Emperor and Empress Dowager. Ku He calmly shook his head. When the skin on his neck touched slightly with his clothing, there was a tearing pain. This kind of pain was, without question, something that humans could not endure. However, it was as if he didn't feel anything. He only furrowed his brows slightly. Mu Peng knelt to his teacher's left. Looking at the bloody marks on the back of his teacher's clothing, his heart was filled with grief. He couldn't resist crying. With this cry, the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs kneeling in front of Master Ku, he also felt sorrow. Adding to his fear for Northern Qi's future, his eyes grew wet. He knelt and crawled 2 steps forward. Fiercely kowtowing 3 times in front of Master Ku he gritted his teeth and said, "General Shang Shanhu is in the south and I am in Shangjing. Unless we die, we will not allow the court to be harmed in the slightest. Even if we die, we will protect the emperor's safety." Ku He glanced at him with a gentle gaze and warmly said, "It's been 12 years since you left the mountains. The future of the Qi kingdom needs your heart and your life." The head of the Bureau of Military Affairs kowtowed again, gritted his teeth, stood up and left. As he walked out the door, his eyes were slightly red. Unexpectedly, he saw the ashen-faced emperor and couldn't help but sigh. The Northern Qi emperor had been waiting outside the room for a long time. Seeing his official's slightly red eyes, His heart thumped as if it had sunk into an endless abyss. Raising his feet, he charged into the room. Beside him, Lang Qiao pulled on his sleeve. The Northern Qi Emperor turned his head and glared coldly at Lang Qiao. Unconsciously, Lang Qiao felt a glimmer of fear. Although the emperor had followed him to learn martial arts, he still did not have much talent in martial arts. However, the might of an emperor grew stronger and stronger. "You can come in." Master Ku He's voice faintly rang out from outside the room. The Northern Qi Emperor tidied up his clothing. With a serious expression, he turned and led the Empress Dowager's hand into the room. Inside the doors at the top of the mountain, other than Ku He, who was sitting on the ground like a withered tree, there were only a few of his closest disciples, as well as the Emperor and Empress Dowager. He was indeed like a withered tree. Although there was a wide and soft robe covering the great Grandmaster's body, everyone who saw Ku He felt a chill in their hearts. It was as if, through the thin robe, they could see the cracks on the Imperial Advisor's body like a dry field, as well as the faint blood stains on his collar. Such a heavy injury was indeed impossible to heal. The Northern Qi Emperor's heart chilled. Without any pretense, he knelt cleanly in front of Ku He and kowtowed one last time to him. "Granduncle." Everyone under heaven bowed to the emperor. The emperor never bowed to anyone. However, the Northern Qi Emperor had bowed to Ku He twice and kowtowed twice. The first time was when he was very young. At that time, the previous emperor had just passed away. The Empress Dowager had held the little emperor as they sat in the beautiful main hall of the royal palace in Shangjing and kowtowed to Master Ku He. Ku He had guaranteed the safety of the mother and son for over a dozen years. He had ensured that the Northern Qi royal family was surnamed War and allowed the little emperor to grow up. This second kowtow was the Northern Qi Emperor bidding farewell to his granduncle. In his heart, he had always felt a sense of distance and fear toward this deified granduncle. However, he felt even more gratitude. The Empress Dowager sat by Ku He's side. She lowered her head and wept silently. "All right, who won't die?" Ku He lowered his eyes slightly and quietly said, "I have already lived for so many years. It can be said that I have benefited greatly from heaven. Everyone will die, and that person in the Qing kingdom is no exception." Ku He had not personally spoken of the truth of what happened on Dong Mountain. Shang Shanhu had only guessed a little and reported it to the royal palace in Shangjing. Hearing Master Ku He say this, the Northern Qi Emperor's heart chilled. He knew that it was indeed so. His counterpart in the Qing kingdom was extremely powerful. Looking at the emperor's expression, Ku He lightly said, "Are you afraid?" The Northern Qi Emperor pressed his lips tightly together. He didn't know how to reply. In his life, he had been the goal the Qing Emperor had fought for. He even faintly saw the Qing Emperor as his idol. He only thought that one day he would defeat the Qing Emperor. Now he found that the Qing Emperor's silent endurance these dozen years was all an illusion. Such a far-sighted emperor was much more experienced and ruthless than him. Furthermore, the Qing Emperor was a great grandmaster. "Fear is a very normal emotion," Ku He faintly said. Ku He faintly said, "When his finger touched the space between my brows, even I felt a glimmer of fear. This person has the heart of an emperor and the strength of a great grandmaster. There is not a single weakness or opening on him. Most terrifying of all is his perseverance. For the sake of his goal of sweeping through the wilderness, he was able to plan for decades. He was single-minded and never made any mistakes. Such a person is not like a person at all." Ku He smiled slightly and gave the Qing Emperor an evaluation. "Everyone falsely claims that I am the one closest to a god in the world. No one knows that the one in the south, who is emotionless, without hate, without love and without separation, is the true god. Is there really nothing we can do about the Qing Emperor?" The person who asked this question in a trembling voice was Lang Qiao. He knew that the emperor also wanted to ask this question. However, as an emperor he could not speak. A person who stands at the pinnacle of martial arts, worldly power, and wisdom. Such a person is naturally impossible to defeat. Ku He was a bit tired. He closed his eyes and said, "It is basically impossible to defeat him from the outside." The Northern Qi Emperor was still kneeling in front of Ku He. Two glimmers of emotion flashed through his eyes. Suddenly he bowed and said, "Granduncle, I am going to worship the temple." The temple. When these two words came out of the emperor's mouth, the entire room fell silent. None of the 6 people said anything. Lang Qiao and Bai Shen met each other's eyes and saw the shock in the other's eyes. Mu Peng gently supported his teacher's body and glanced at the emperor with astonishment. In an instant, the emotions in the eyes of the 3 eldest disciples of Tianyi Dao became serious and faintly excited. In the present world, no one could defeat the Qing Emperor. However, there was still the temple. Given the power of an immortal, was there nothing they could do against a mortal? The temple was illusory. It was only a myth or legend. The 6 people in the room all knew that after Shaoen's death, there was only one person who knew of the temple's existence and where it was. It was Ku He. The Northern Qi Emperor had never given up on the thought of worshipping the temple and obtaining the support of a mysterious power. Back then he had wholeheartedly rescued and imprisoned Shaoen. He had even clashed head-on with Ku He's faction because he wanted to know the secret in Shaoen's mind. The temple? Master Ku He slowly opened his eyes and looked at the emperor kneeling in front of him. The Northern Qi Emperor had thought that his granduncle's gaze would be sharp and angry because the only person in the world who had been to the temple was him. Furthermore, he had always hidden the true existence of the temple from the entire world at all costs. However, there was only faint mockery in Ku He's eyes, as well as the glimmer of a complicated smile. He knew, including his disciple, that when faced with a powerful Qing ruler, everyone unconsciously had the thought that they could not defeat him. That was why they had placed their hopes on the illusory temple. I know where the temple is. Ku He once again slowly closed his eyes. But I won't tell you. Shock appeared on the faces of everyone beside him. They thought, if you are going to take this secret to the yellow dirt, how can the Qi kingdom be protected? Ku He closed his eyes and quietly said, the temple is just a pair of eyes. It has never interfered with the affairs of the world. Why disturb it? Without waiting for anyone to reply, a self-mocking smile appeared at the corners of Ku He's lips. Besides, do you really think the temple is omnipotent? He opened his eyes and stared at the emperor in front of him. With sincere and heartfelt words he said, don't place your hopes on something that does not exist in hope. Your Majesty, before I went to Dong Mountain this time, I met with Sigu Jian and made sufficient preparations for the situation at the top of the mountain. Ku He looked at him and faintly said, do you know what we think the Qing Emperor's final trump card is? The Northern Qi Emperor shook his head in confusion. Although he was a supreme being, he still felt fear towards strange existences like the great Grandmaster in the temple. Sigu Jian and I thought that the Qing Emperor's final support was someone from the temple. Ku He smiled warmly, but everyone else in the room was shocked. Did the Qing Emperor have secret connections with the temple? Ku He smiled slightly and said, if it was only someone from the temple, then there is nothing to fear. What we fear is that the temple will break its own rules. However, the Qing Emperor does not have the power to do this. No one in the world understood the temple better than Ku He. Although his understanding of the outside world was only a shallow level, he understood that person. That was enough. The temple did not interfere in worldly affairs. If someone truly came to help the Qing Emperor, then the black-clothed blind man at the top of the mountain would certainly stand on the other side of the temple. This was why Ku He had never worried about this matter. There are no immortal emperors or saviors in this world. Ku He sighed and thought of the words that Immortal had once said to him and Shaoen many years ago. When you reach the realm of a great grandmaster, you will discover that the temple is actually nothing more than this. An existence that does not appear in the world is no different from a dead object. Although he was about to die, his light words revealed a calm and accurate evaluation of the temple. Then what should we do? Although the fire in the Northern Qi Emperor's heart still burned and he would not give up on the thought of finding the temple because of a few words from Master Ku He, he knew he couldn't ask any more. Grand Uncle Ku He didn't have much time. When a person cannot be knocked down from the outside, we can only hope that some problems will appear on the inside, Ku He said quietly. If the Qing kingdom wants to send an army north, it will take at least 3 years. Your Majesty must think of all ways to delay this time a bit longer. Delay? The Northern Qi Emperor repeated this in his heart and furrowed his brows. This was only a temporary solution. The longer we delay, the more beneficial it is for us because no one knows what will happen on the Qing kingdom's side. You are talking about Fan Xian? The Northern Qi Emperor looked at Ku He's old appearance in shock. Pressing his thin lips together, he firmly shook his head. Fan Xian is not enough to change the Qing Emperor's mind. No one can. Furthermore, he is, after all, a Qing person. He cannot stand on the side of the Qi kingdom. Who knows? Master Ku He looked at him with a calm gaze. Fan Xian has always been different from anyone else. He is the Qing Emperor's illegitimate child. Furthermore, the Qing Emperor trusts him greatly. The Northern Qi Emperor calmly expressed an opposing opinion. The Northern Qi Emperor calmly expressed an opposing opinion. What I can give him, the Qing Emperor can give him even more. Besides, Even if he votes for me, it would be impossible for him to cause any harm to the situation under heaven. But you forgot, he is also the son of the young lady of the Yi family. Ku Hi's smile appeared somewhat strange. Furthermore, you still underestimate Fan Xian's use. Don't always think of him as an immortal poet, a prince of the Qin kingdom, or a powerful official. These all appear to be important figures. His most important identity is actually the son of the young lady of the Yi family. He has already inherited and grasped many important things. The Northern Qi Emperor's heart jumped. He raised his head in astonishment to look at Master Ku Hi. Huge waves churned in his heart. He understood the meaning behind his grandfather's words, but he did not dare believe it. To be able to share the benefits of the Jiangnan Palace treasury through Fan Xian's hands was already the best situation the Northern Qi Emperor could imagine. However, hearing his granduncle's meaning, he was hoping that Fan Xian would move the entire palace treasury to Northern Qi. Something like a great grandmaster can be used to create chaos in a country, but it cannot be used to conquer a country or build a country, Ku Hi said warmly. The Qing Emperor will not go so far as to challenge the world alone. Military power and national power cannot be lacking. At the end of a war, it still relies on national power. Unless the Qing Emperor runs to Shangjing and becomes the enemy of tens of thousands of people. Ku Hi's smile became amused. But he is such a serious person who wishes to write his glorious name in history. How could he be as crazy as Sigu Jian? The Northern Qi Emperor's lips were slightly dry. He still could not believe Ku Hi's judgment. Fan Xian, he refused to be a prince. What right did he have to vote for him? Was it because of the agreement between him and Haitang? Who would believe that an empty agreement with no proof would make Fan Xian pay such a large price? Everyone else was silent, listening to the conversation between Ku Hi and the Northern Qi Emperor. Ku Hi gazed at the Emperor and quietly said, "Even if you place your hopes on Fan Xian, you cannot show anything in these 2 years." Understood. I will immediately make arrangements to act against Fan Xizha. Ku Hi nodded and felt gratified in his heart. The Emperor was indeed extraordinarily intelligent. He had only mentioned it slightly, and he already knew what to do to not arouse the Qing Emperor's suspicions. As I said earlier, stall for time, Ku Hi said with his head lowered. After I die, Mu Peng, immediately go down the mountain to the Qing kingdom. Everyone looked at Ku Hi in surprise. They didn't know why he was giving his second disciple, Mu Peng, a mission at this time. Although there were not many Tianyi Dao disciples, of the 4 disciples, Mu Peng had always been the most low-key and the weakest link. Other than medical skills, he had nothing else to rely on. You live on the mountain for a long time. Not many people in the outside world know what you look like. Ku Hi gently coughed but used his hand to cover it, not letting the blood spray out. Looking at his second disciple beside him, he said in an even voice, "I want you to go to the Qin kingdom. You don't need to do anything. Just think of a way to treat Qin Pingping's illness." Treat Qin Pingping's illness? Everyone was shocked. Who was Qin Pingping? He was the Qing Emperor's closest and most loyal official. Regardless of whether it was 30 years ago or the Dong Mountain incident that had just happened in Jingdo, Qin Pingping had played the greatest role. Hearing that the Qing Emperor's old dog's health was getting worse and worse and that he didn't have many years left to live, the people of Northern Qi and Dongyi all felt joy in their hearts. Yet, Master Ku Hi had his disciple with extraordinary medical skills go treat his illness. Ku Hi stared at Mu Peng sternly. "No matter what, I want you to guarantee that Qin Pingping will be able to live and will not die of natural causes like sickness." These were heavy words. Although Mu Peng did not understand, he still lowered his head and agreed. Everyone in the room looked at Ku Hi as if they wanted to hear an explanation. Ku Hi was silent and did not speak. This was Ku Hi's last move before he died. After stabilizing the internal politics of the Qi kingdom, he had turned his gaze to the south. He had already thrown out 2 moves. Qin Pingping's side was the one he pulled back from. Master Ku Hi was not the emperor of the Qin kingdom. He did not weave a shocking situation that spanned decades. Instead, he had acutely captured a glimmer of light based on his understanding of that little fairy from a long, long time ago. Through his decades of spying on human nature, as well as the Dong Mountain matter and some existences that had been slightly eliminated, he was guessing. He guessed that behind the current peace in the Qin kingdom hid an old trouble that tore apart people's hearts. If Qin Pingping died of illness or natural old age, then Ku Hi's guesses about human nature would not be of any use. Thus, he had to ensure that Qin Pingping could live on well until one day in the future when someone did not want him to continue living. Everything seemed to have been arranged. Ku Hi had no more hopes for this world. He closed his eyes as if he was about to fall asleep. The Empress Dowager forcefully suppressed the sorrow and fear in her heart. In a trembling voice she said, "How will the Taoist sect be dealt with in the future?" Tianyi Dao's Taoist sect was deeply rooted in the kingdom. The ascetic monks traveled through most of the world. Faintly, they still had some connection to the Qing temple system in the Qing kingdom. With such a great power, how exactly would they be dealt with after Ku He's death? However, there were Ku He's three main disciples in the sect. Due to their status, they could not open their mouths to ask. Ku He's eyes remained closed as if he was tired. In a quiet voice he said, "Hand the Taoist sect to Haitang." Everyone bowed and accepted the order. The three main disciples, including Lang Qiao, were not surprised. The Emperor and Empress Dowager also knew that Ku He had already made this decision many years ago. Everyone had long seen Haitang as the next leader of Tianyi Dao. However, where was Haitang today? Everyone had questions in their hearts. It was said that Haitang was still on the mountain last night, but her whereabouts were unknown. When Master Ku He was about to die, his most beloved disciple, the successor of Tianyi Dao, was not by the master's side. "Haitang has gone to do some things," Ku He said quietly with his eyes closed. "She will not return during these 3 years. The matters of Tianyi Dao will be handed to Lang Qiao, and this mountain will be handed to your little sister disciple. He said these words to Lang Qiao and the other two. Although the matters of Tianyi Dao were handed to Lang Qiao, the mountain was the true foundation of Tianyi Dao. Little sister disciple? Lang Qiao and the other two disciples looked at each other. Was he referring to the young lady of the Fan family? The Northern Qi Emperor's pupils constricted slightly. He immediately understood the meaning of these words. He began to prepare in his heart how to use this matter. Suppress Xia Mingji and allow Fan Roro's name to shine brightly on the mountain. The imperial advisor was indeed skilled. The more he did this, the more the Qing Emperor would suspect that Northern Qi was purposely provoking him. On the contrary, he would not suspect Fan Xian. It would be safer for Northern Qi's last hope of survival. However, until now, the Northern Qi Emperor still did not believe that Fan Xian would one day come to his country with an incomparably generous dowry. After handing over all the mundane matters, Ku He closed his lips and didn't say another word. He calmly felt the life in his body flow away. Other than a slight sense of loss, there was also a glimmer of joyful understanding. It was as if everything that had happened these years floated before his eyes. In the end, those scenes stopped decades ago, on that seemingly endless patch of white snow. In his last moments, Ku He thought of the shrieking vultures in the sky and his subordinates who had fallen dead on the way. The never-ending night, the faint light in the tent in the darkness, the silent Xiao En, and the neatly arranged human arms at the edge of the tent. It was an incomparably majestic black-green temple built against the mountain. The blind man who killed his way out of the temple. The little girl who ran out of the temple. Human flesh was not very tasty. He had already lived for so many years and knew what the temple was like. What was there to be dissatisfied with? Just like this, the great Grandmaster Ku He sank into his memories and passed away with a complicated smile. On an icy plain to the north of Northern Qi, a girl wearing clothes woven from animal skin was using the man language to greet the people of her tribe. The girl's face was bright red and full of smiles, but a faint sadness and confusion appeared in her eyes. The continuous years of snowstorms made it impossible for the northern man to survive on this wasteland. Thus, the tribe that the famous General Shang Shanhu had been unable to subdue for many years began to move around the tall sky veins and toward the warmer south. Many tribes had already settled on the grasslands to the northwest of the Qin kingdom. However, they had paid the price of many lives to obtain the acceptance of their distant relatives. There were also some tribes as well as the old, weak women who lived on the ice and snow wasteland to the north. Perhaps because the number of tribes had decreased greatly, the small amount of prey was able to support these people's survival. Not long ago, a girl who was said to have been lost from the Ka-Erna tribe came to these tribes and began to follow everyone to hunt and herd sheep. Everyone liked this girl because she was diligent and capable. No matter how fierce a horse was, it could only be obedient in her hands. No matter how fierce a beast was, it seemed to be afraid of hurting her and would run far away. The simple and straightforward man people just didn't like the way this Ka-Erna girl walked. In such a difficult environment, that kind of wobbly walking method seemed to waste too much energy. Chapter 593. On the last day, the situation for monthly votes is too dangerous. If anyone still has monthly votes, please vote them for me. Thank you. The flowers in the forest withered, the red of the spring. The summer dream, the autumn wind, too hurried. It was another winter in the Qin kingdom. The temperature seemed to have dropped within a day. Snow began to fall on the Tsang Mountains in the west of the capital. The mountain tops gradually turned white. 2 small bouts of cold rain fell in Jingdo, adding to the chill. The people on the streets were wrapped in thick cotton robes. They rubbed their hands and walked with hurried expressions. The carriages coming and going on Tianhe Avenue exchanged blows with the ground, making an irritating monotonous sound. The horses all breathed out impatiently and turned their heads. It was as if they wanted the winter to end faster. In a black carriage, Fan Xian flipped up his fur collar and blew a breath of hot air into his hands. He tightened the fur cloak on his body and muttered a few words. He thought to himself that the winter had come too quickly. He had just come out of King Jing's manor. King Jing was sick, very sick. Hongqing was not in the capital. Rojia was also young. Fan Xian could only take on the role of an assistant. Every day he went to serve the medicine, talk with him and relieve the king's boredom. Given his present identity, it was indeed inappropriate for him to do such things. However, Fan Xian knew the relationship between King Jing's family and his own. Furthermore, he had always felt some remorse toward Hongqing, so he was particularly attentive. He knew why King Jing, who looked old but was actually in good health, had suddenly come down with a cold. None of this had anything to do with the winter. It was only related to the severe cold in the royal family. The Empress Dowager had died, the eldest princess had died, and half of King Jing's family had died in this incident. The cruel reality had finally knocked down the flower farmer king. Coming out of King Jing's manor, Fan Xian did not return directly to the manor. He also did not enter the palace. Instead he went to Baoyue brothel. Today was the day Shi Chanli and Sang Wen returned to the capital to report on their work. He had to learn the most secretive information in the world from the mouths of these 2 trusted aides. After staying in the building for a while, Fan Xian looked over the information that Baoyue brothel had gathered from the tentacles they had spread all over the world. He furrowed his brows and looked at Sang Wen's gentle face. He looked at the beard growing on Shi Chanli's lips and sighed. There was nothing special about this information. It was similar to the Overwatch Council's. 3 months had passed since the Dong Mountain incident. The entire world had entered winter. As early as 2 months ago, news of Master Ku He's death had spread from northern Qi. The death of a great grandmaster shocked the people of the world, but it did not surprise Fan Xian too much. This was something that the emperor had already predicted. Fan Xian was only wary of what northern Qi would do in response to Ku He's death. During these 2 months, northern Qi had been very quiet. Other than Shang Shanhu continuously defending against the Qin kingdom's probing attacks in the south, there had been no major movements. Fan Xian lowered his head and smiled as he thought about it. If Xia Mingji's stronghold in Shangjing was not taken into account, the northern Qi emperor had finally taken action against Fan Xizha. It was said that the second Fan elder was living in fear and unease in Shangjing. However, Fan Xian was not worried at all. From his sister's letter, he could tell at a glance exactly what the little emperor wanted to do and express to him. What made Fan Xian uneasy was that Haitang Duo, this woman who had a close relationship with him and the successor of Tianyi Dao, had suddenly disappeared without a trace. No one knew where she had gone. Even the internal members of Tianyi Dao did not know. He did not know that a famous doctor called Feng Chun had already entered Jingdo and was beginning to make a name for himself. He had received the attention of the Imperial Academy of Medicine. Because of his northern Qi identity, he was still unable to enter the palace as an attendant. Instead, he was sent to the manors of various officials to demonstrate the emperor's favor. King Jing's illness was personally treated by Fan Xian, so Sir Feng Chun had never met Fan Xian. No matter how clever Fan Xian was, he would not be able to guess that, in the near future, Sir Feng Chun would go to Qin Garden to carefully protect Director Chen's life at all costs. The chess moves Ku he had made before his death were all loose pieces. On their own they did not have any effect. They only ensured that the internal situation in the Qin kingdom would continue to move step by step in a certain direction. Fan Xian was only worried about Haitang. He didn't know what Ku he had told Haitang when he would see her, or with what identity he would see her. There was also something that made the entire Qin court feel fear. Ku he was already dead. Northern Qi did not hold a funeral in secret. Instead, they held the ceremony with great fanfare. Hundreds of thousands of officials and commoners from various roads and provinces went to cry for the soul. The northern Qi court did not seem to sink into a state of panic or unease because of Ku he's death. Sigu Jian, who should have already died in Dongyi according to the Qing emperor's calculations, had stubbornly held on and not died. This sword saint's body was as valiant as a cockroach. Although his breathing was weak and his life hung by a thread, he held onto this thread tightly and refused to let go. The dying Sigujien was hidden in the sword hut. Although this sword saint had become a cripple, his reputation was still there. All of Dongyi seemed to have a pillar of support. Problems also began to appear within Dongyi. After Sigujian's death, the dispute between the master of the city's manor and the sword hut was perhaps about to surface. For the Qing Emperor, Sigujian's life and death was no longer a problem. After his death, the ownership of Dongyi was the major problem. Fan Xian lowered his head and thought. Dongyi was different from northern Qi in the Qing kingdom. It was isolated by the sea and surrounded by vassal states. If Sigujian died, a ferocious beast would immediately become a delicious, tender piece of meat waiting to be cut. Regardless of whether it was the northern Qi emperor or his own emperor, neither would let go of this piece of fresh meat. However, he didn't know who the emperor would send to steal it. He raised his head and glanced at Shi Chanli and Sangwen. He briefly told Shi Chanli about the situation in the Jiangnan Palace treasury. Although Su Wenmao endlessly sent him secret reports, Fan Xian still trusted Shi Chanli's instinctive impression more. The production of the palace treasury continued to maintain high efficiency. With Fan Xian's strong cooperation, the old shopkeepers of the Seven Leaves gradually raised the level of the three workshops to the level of the old Yi family. Fan Xian's heart felt slightly more at ease. He had two knives in his hands. One was the Overwatch Council, and the other was the palace treasury. Regardless of whether it was for the emperor's trust or for his own power, he had to hold on tight and do a good job. Of Fan Xian's 4 disciples, only Shi Chanli remained by Fan Xian's side. Hou Jichang, Yang Wanli, and Qing Jialin were all fighting up in their respective positions. With Fan Xian's protection and financial support, in addition to their own abilities presumably, it wouldn't be long before they became important figures in the Qing court. There are many vacancies in the court. The emperor has chosen many young people. At this time, age and experience are no longer important. Fan Xian gazed at Shi Chanli and smiled warmly. In a moment, write a letter to the 3 of them and have them prepare. At the beginning of spring, the court will probably summon them to the capital to report on their work. In his arrangements, Yang Wanli should be working in the Ministry of Works. Because Hou Jichang had handled the Jiaozhou matter, his position was particularly stable and deeply admired by the emperor. He should be directly promoted by 2 levels and become Jiaozhou Zhizhou. As for Qing Jialin, his path had been smooth sailing. He was probably the most glorious person in the Suzhou government. Shi Chanli's mouth was slightly open. He had not expected that the 4 poor scholars would each have such good fortune in just a few years. He truly could not catch up. Fan Xian knew what he was thinking and asked with a smile, "What is it?" Their experience is too shallow and cannot convince the masses. Most importantly, everyone in court knows that the 3 of them are your students. I'm afraid it will cause criticism, Shi Chanli said seriously. Fan Xian raised his eyelids slightly and mockingly said, "A few hundred officials have died. Someone has to fill in. Where would there be so many candidates with experience? Don't say his experience is shallow. Back then, He Zongwei was as famous as Hou Jichang and entered the court after Jichang. Now, he already has the right to enter the royal study to listen to discussions. Is his experience deep enough?" He Zongwei was a name that Fan Xian had a deep memory of. Back then, in the restaurant of Yishir Tavern, he had met this seemingly honest young scholar. It was this scholar who caused many things in Jingdou in the future, such as his father-in-law being forced to tragically resign. This person was originally on good terms with Guo Baoquan, the son of Guoyu, the Minister of Rights. He was on the crown prince's side through and through. Later on, he became an imperial censor in the imperial censorate and began to advise the second prince. Later on, he switched sides with the crown prince. After switching sides twice, people finally realized that he was on the eldest princess's side. He was just following the eldest princess's wishes. However, during the Jingdou rebellion, it was this imperial censor of the left who led a group of imperial censors to run around naked. He gambled that the crown prince, Li Qingqian, could not bear to kill people and forcefully delayed the rebel army's entry into the capital for a night. This gave Fan Xian the opportunity to launch a surprise attack on the royal palace, control the center and reverse the situation in one move. Only now did people truly see clearly that He Zongwei was no one's man. He was only the emperor's man. He had always been. The emperor had returned to the capital and He Zongwei had been rewarded for his great service. He climbed up like a rocket. Although he only held his original position in the imperial censorate, he had the right to discuss matters in the Hall of Governmental Affairs. Anyone with a discerning eye knew that imperial censor he might one day take over the position of the already old Shu the scholar. His future was bright and immeasurable. During the turmoil in Jingdo, He Zongwei had helped Fan Xian greatly. Even though he was now in a high position of power, each time he ran into Fan Xian in court or outside, he was still incomparably respectful. There was nothing to nitpick about and appeared exceptionally humble. However, Fan Xian disliked this person. Perhaps it was because he had seen this person's burning desire for power a long time ago. Perhaps it was because he disliked this kind of person who sold others to climb up. Perhaps it was because he had once punched He Zongwei and he knew that someone like He Zongwei would certainly hold a grudge. Fan Xian was not afraid of He Zongwei. However, he had to be on guard because he was greatly admired by the emperor. Petty people were always more terrifying than noble people. Presently, the private discussion of He Zongwei in the officialdom was somewhat unbearable. They gave him the nickname of a traitor. Everyone felt that this nickname was very fitting. Not many people knew that this nickname had come from the Fan Manners study. Sometimes Fan Xian asked himself honestly. The things He Zongwei did were not more shameless than what he did. Why did he hate him so much? In reality it was very simple. Fan Xian had once seen He Zongwei's burning and greedy gaze toward Ruoruo. Because of this gaze he remembered him for a lifetime. He wanted to suppress him for a lifetime and make it so that he would never be able to rise again. I didn't think that right now, your sister would be singing in Qin Garden. Fan Xian glanced at Sangwen and smiled. He liked Sangwen very much. She was gentle, silent, and amiable. It wasn't that he had any romantic thoughts about her. He just felt that when he was with this woman he would feel at ease for some reason. It was just like when he was with De Bao. As for the Sangwen sister he spoke of, it was the woman who sang when he went to Qin Garden to see Qin Pingping. Qin Pingping liked Sangwen's voice very much. However, Sangwen had to manage Baoyue brothel and expand Fan Xian's grand plan to the entire world. It was impossible for her to stay in Jingdo for long. Thus, Qin Pingping, who loved to enjoy life, could only settle for the next best thing. He brought Sangwen's sister from Yanjing to Jingdo. Sangwen smiled warmly and said, "As long as the director likes it." Fan Xian sighed and thought of something else. Because of his appearance he had already changed countless people's lives. Countless people had gathered at his side because of him. Even Sangwen's sister was no exception. Thinking of these people, how could he bear to quietly leave? However, there were people who could bear to leave. Fan Xian stood in the little courtyard with an unusually ugly expression. The disappointment in his eyes could not be hidden. The well in the courtyard was still there, the stone table was still there, the cotton curtains were still there, and the green shells were still there. However, the people were not there anymore. This was Wang Qinyan's little courtyard. It was hidden deep among the people in the western part of the city. It was not eye-catching. Fan Xian had once eaten many meals in this courtyard, teased old Wang's charming and shy girl, and played with the gourds on the shelves. However, none of this could come back. Wang Qinyan's family had already moved away without a sound. He thought to himself, "You should all leave and leave me alone in this place that is not suitable for people." A moment later he thought it through and bowed toward the little courtyard. His secrets were too terrifying. Perhaps it had made Wang Qinyan's life difficult and stressful these years. Perhaps he preferred the muddle-headed days of the past and a life without pressure. He hoped that Wang Qinyan's family would be safe in the future. Fan Xian sighed and walked out of the courtyard. Turning his head to look at the silent Mu Feng beside him, he furrowed his brows and said, "Why are you pulling a long face? Your wife has already given birth to a second child. Do you still miss the daughter of Lao Wang's family?" After Wang Qinyan left, Fan Xian had to have a personal attendant at his side. The most suitable candidate, Deng Ziyu, was far away in Shangjing in northern Qi, carrying out a difficult mission. Su Wenmao could not be moved in the palace treasury, so there was no other way. Fan Xian could only promote Mu Tai's nephew. After following him for a month, there was no problem with this kid's loyalty, but he was not as interesting as Wang Qinyan. It was his unfamiliarity and inconvenience that made Fan Xian understand that Sir Wang Qinyan was far from just a sidekick. His abilities were actually all hidden under his smile. Usually he just didn't see it. Thinking of this, his thoughts became even more faint as water. The rewards that had been delayed for 2 months finally came. Other than the civil officials who had filled in the empty positions at the beginning of the rebellion, the various people who had truly accomplished great service in quelling the rebellion finally received an edict from the palace. Yi Zhong was promoted and rewarded generously. He entered the capital as the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs. However, the position of commander of the Jingdo garrison was given to Xiao Jinhua, the commander of Donghua Gate who had blocked the crown prince's rebel army inside the city. The original commander of the 13 city guards, Zhang Diqing, was killed by 1,000 cuts after being captured. 3 of his family members were executed. This was the heaviest punishment in the entire rebellion. Fan Xian did not forcefully oppose the emperor on this matter. Although he knew that Zhang Diqing's cousins had nothing to do with this matter, he knew the emperor's anger on the matter of Zhang Diqing. The emperor trusted Zhang Diqing greatly, but Zhang Diqing had betrayed. If he didn't kill a few more, he wouldn't be able to vent the emperor's dark emotions. The great prince still controlled the imperial army. None of the rewards had fallen behind. However, he had already been made Prince Huqing and could not be given any more. Gong Dian had been moved back to the palace and began to take over the affairs of the guards. As for how the future would be arranged, the emperor knew and Fan Xian could guess. As for Fan Xian's reward, there was a small problem. According to news from the palace, the emperor had been prepared to directly bestow Fan Xian the title of Junwang. However, he had been fearfully blocked by the scholars Hu and Shu. A different surname being made a king had never happened before. No wonder the officials were terrified by the emperor's initial edict. Although everyone knew that Fan Xian was the emperor's illegitimate child, his surname was, after all, Fan. If he suddenly became a king, the Qing kingdom would be laughed at by the world. Fan Xian was also shocked. Becoming a king and the king of Donghua at that. What was this? Fortunately, this edict had been blocked. He was incomparably grateful to the scholars Hu and Shu. First-rank Duke of Donghua was already the limit for non-royal descendants. As for the land and gold, Fan Xian did not care much about it. He was currently one of the wealthiest people in the world. Perhaps the emperor also knew that other rewards would not satisfy Fan Xian, which was why he had made the absurd suggestion of making him a king at the beginning. He could not be made a king. Unexpectedly, the palace finally sent down an edict to bestow the name Fan Shuning on Fan Xian's daughter, Fan Xiaohua, and make her a princess. Preposterous. There were countless preposterous things in the world, but none was more preposterous than this. The daughter of a minister was actually conferred the title of a princess, and this daughter was not even born of the first wife, yet she insisted on using Lin Wan'er's title as a descendant. It was too absurd. No one would have thought that the emperor would have such a stubborn and mischievous side. Of course, in Fan Xian's opinion, the most absurd thing was the name the emperor had given the girl, Shunning. Did you think you were playing around? No matter how absurd this edict was, a glimmer of warmth still rose in Fan Xian's heart. He felt the emperor's intentions. The next day he entered the palace to see the emperor and give thanks. Along the way he asked if Shunning's name could be changed. Without waiting for him to open his mouth, the emperor smiled slightly and said, Jiaozhou Su Maokai. I removed him from his position and let him retire. He has already returned to Quanzhou. Hearing this, Fan Xian's heart jumped. His mouth was dry. He was so shocked he couldn't say a word. He didn't dare to say anything else. He kowtowed in thanks and silently returned to the manor. He thought deeply for a long time in the manor study, calculating just what the emperor wanted to do and what he knew. He knew where Su Maokai had given himself away. From Dong Mountain to Danzhou, Su Maokai had helped him resist the Jiaozhou navy, landed on the shore and broken arrows. It was clear that he was one of his people. Before the Jiaozhou navy was trapped on Dong Mountain, Su Maokai had not sent any news to the court. Although the emperor counted all of this in his heart, he cared deeply about the heart of any official. It was clear that Su Maokai was loyal to Fan Xian and not to the court. After the matter, the emperor only needed to check Su Maocai's history these years to connect it to the once illustrious Quanzhou navy. If this had been any other time, it would have been difficult for Su Maokai to escape death. Fortunately, Fan Xian had always displayed unwavering loyalty to the emperor, including the Dong Mountain incident. After experiencing countless tests, he had finally obtained the emperor's absolute trust. This time he did not kill Su Maokai and did not say it explicitly. He only said he was letting him retire. This could be considered giving Fan Xian enough face. Fan Xian's heart felt a bit cold. He also felt a bit confused. Once again he sank into confusion. The next day he did not enter the palace to ask for forgiveness because he was not guilty. However, he occasionally couldn't help but think that the emperor was much gentler than before. If it had been the crown prince or the second prince, this matter would not have ended as easily as it did today. The gentler the emperor was to him, the more uncomfortable Fan Xian felt. In the palace, The emperor had once asked about the situation of the tyrannical Jinchi in his body. Knowing that there was no danger of his body exploding, he remained silent and did not say a word. Fan Xian could not understand what his true attitude was. Time was like snow. It scattered and gently fell, easily covering everything in the world. When northern Qi, southern Qin, and western Hu were all covered in snow, the sound of firecrackers gradually rang out. Fragrance filled the air. It was the arrival of the spring festival. The 8th year of the Qin calendar had finally arrived. During the time of internal chaos in the Qin kingdom, regardless of whether it was the Empress Dowager who had been in power for a few days, or the emperor who had returned to the capital, they all resolutely used the powerful military forces in their hands to attack in all directions. They used such an overbearing momentum to intimidate everyone in the world. In the west, Li Hongqing was following the Western Expedition Army and coldly watching the movements of the Hu people in the wind and snow. After the Hu people's power gathered the elite of the northern man, they had become more and more powerful. However, the snow-covered plains made everyone resist the harsh nature. No one was in the mood to fight. They had to wait until the first spring grass grew and the Hu people's horses gained their first layer of fat before the Hu people would once again come to Shiliang Road in the Qin kingdom to carry out the routine that had lasted for 100 years. The entertainment that had been banned in Jingdo for a month because of the Empress Dowager's death was finally lifted. Perhaps it was to show that the Qin kingdom was still singing and dancing, but the emperor continuously issued a number of benevolent edicts. Dances danced, horses galloped, firecrackers rang, red lanterns hung high, and Jingdo was a fiery red. On the first day of the new year, Fan Xian was brought to the palace by the emperor. He ate a meal and missed the important event of the Fan clan. After another 2 days, Fan Xian finally escaped and brought his entire family to a place on the outskirts of Jingdo. This place was completely different from the festive atmosphere of the new year. It was shrouded in an oppressive, sorrowful, and gloomy atmosphere. This was a cemetery, a new cemetery. The emperor did not allow the bodies of the people who participated in the rebellion to be taken away by wild dogs. Instead, he gathered them together and buried them in one place. He also did not restrict relatives from coming to pay their respects. This edict touched countless people. A few tombs of clearly different styles and sizes were on the hill. Fan Xian held his daughter with Lin Wan'er and Cece behind him. He stood in front of these tombs and turned his head to look at the wisps of green smoke rising from the cemetery below. He was silent. Before they came here, they had already gone to another tomb to pay their respects to the subordinates of the Overwatch Council and imperial soldiers who had died in the Jingdo Rebellion. Fan Xian did not go to the royal mausoleum, although the Empress Dowager was buried there. He came directly to this side and came to the top of this hill. Pulling back his gaze from below, he looked at these large tombs silently. The crown prince, the second prince, the empress, and the eldest princess were all buried here. No matter how benevolent the emperor had become, he would not allow these people to be buried in the royal cemetery. However, this place was facing the water and mountains. It was also a place with good feng shui. Additionally, it was far from the green smoke below, so it could be considered quiet. Putting down the joss paper and incense he had bought, Fan Xian stood in front of the 4 large tombs and bowed. He then followed Lin Wan'er to kneel in front of the eldest princess' grave and kowtowed twice. He then held little Hua-er to show to the people in the grave. In order to ward off evil, he rubbed some wine between little Hua-er's brows. The spiciness made the little girl cry. Fan Xian raised his brows and looked at the stone tomb in front of him. He thought to himself, "My mother-in-law, please don't let little Hua be as strange as you." Seeing that Wan'er was still kneeling on the ground burning joss paper, Fan Xian did not disturb her. Instead, he walked in front of the crown prince, Li Qingqian, and the second prince's graves. Looking at the 2 graves, he couldn't help but quietly recite, "Even if there is a 1,000-year iron threshold in the end, it is still a dirt bun." There were 4 large and hard dirt buns there. Fan Xian looked at them in a daze. His emotions were complicated. It was not until now that he realized that the blood of the Li family not only flowed with madness and perversion, it was also brimming with pride and unyieldingness. He looked at Li Qingqian and the second prince's graves and sighed in his heart. The Li brothers were truly unyielding, much stronger than him. No one knew better than Fan Xian how terrifying death was. However, these 2 Li brothers had died so cleanly and with such pride. They used this kind of death to shatter the emperor's hard outer shell. In this he was not as good as them. Fan Xian lowered his head and thought to himself. Holding De Bao's hand behind him, he walked back to the eldest princess's grave. Looking at Wan'er's tearful eyes, Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then pitifully crouched down and wiped the corners of her eyes. De Bao also followed his actions and crouched down, looking at the large grave innocently. Although he didn't know that the most beautiful woman in the Qing kingdom inside the grave had gradually become white bones, he still felt a glimmer of coldness. The princess mother is inside and not coming out? De Bao asked curiously. Yes, Fan Xian said with a forced smile. Xiao Xianxian, I still feel, why would the princess mother kill Er Bao? She was so beautiful. Lin De Bao furrowed his brows and asked in a very serious voice. Fan Xian's heart thumped. Realizing that Wan did not hear this, he relaxed slightly. A person called Li Yunrui killed Er Bao. This was what Fan Xian had been trying to tell De Bao. Unexpectedly, it couldn't even fool an idiot. He felt a bit bitter in his heart. However, he was unable to explain to De Bao whether a person was beautiful or not was often not the same as what she did. For example, his princess mother and his Xiao Xianxian. The great prince suddenly appeared behind Fan Xian and the others. The third prince went forward and respectfully bowed to Fan Xian. He then affectionately stood by De Bao's side. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and looked at the great prince. Why have you also come? After all, the identities of the people buried in the 4 mud buns were too special. Coming to pay respects was too sensitive. The great prince glanced at him with a cold expression and said, The people buried here are also my brothers. Fan Xian was speechless and said with slight worry, I'm just afraid that the emperor will not be happy. The great prince was suddenly silent. A moment later he quietly said, Father, has also come. Fan Xian was startled and abruptly stood up. Turning his head, he gazed toward a certain spot on the hill. He saw that in the chilly winter forest, there was a figure moving about. A middle-aged man wearing bright yellow clothing was looking at the 4 large graves on this side. Although there were countless guards in front and behind him, he looked very lonely. That night, Fan Xian held a banquet in the manor. Yesterday his father had already resigned and left for Danzhou. Lady Lu had also followed. Presently, only Fan Xian and his family were left in the Fan Manor. It appeared particularly lonely. The banquet Fan Xian held was hot pot. He drank Wuliangye produced by the palace treasury. The guests he had invited were the great prince and third prince. When the hot pot was placed in front of him, Fan Xian seemed to finally understand why he could not forget it since Jiangnan. His heart was empty and he could not find a clue to his thirst. It was spicy. After eating a mouthful of hot pot, it was so spicy that his head was covered in sweat. It was good. He drank a mouthful of strong wine. It was so painful that his throat was dry. The remaining wine in the pot was gone. The great prince was drunk and lying on the table. No one knew what he was talking about. The third prince was also given 2 cups by Fan Xian. He went to the guest room and lay down drunk. There was only Fan Xian left. Under the cold moon of the winter night, his hand held the wine cup. His eyes were blurry. The spiciness was unbearable and the pleasure was unbearable. It was as if tears were about to fall. She sat alone on the roof behind him, facing the bright moon and listening to Fan Xian's drunken poem. She was silent. It seemed that even the black cloth covering her eyes was thinking about who she was. Why did he feel something that he had never felt before when he listened to this song? Fishing terrace, wild gull guess for 10 years. White clouds come and go and green mountains remain. Drink to your heart's content. He owed Yi Zhou for his talents, violated Lu Ruan's prohibition on drinking, and repaid Li Du's poetry debt. Suzhai laughed at me and I laughed at Suzhai. Returning in the evening, the wild apes on West Lake Mountain mourned. 20 years, how many romantic freaks, flowers blooming and withering? On the cloud-gazing platform. The sleeves of the stars to pacify the country broke the Yenyue bewitching stronghold. Suzhai laughed at me and I laughed at Suzhai. It was for the joy in front of the palace. Chapter 594. The battle for third place is too urgent. I'm only a few dozen votes away and I can be overtaken at any time. If anyone still has a monthly vote, please vote. Just at the VIP monthly voting section of the book page. Please. Today is the last day of August, and also the last chapter of Pleasure Before the Palace. The end of this volume, just like the chapter on Ancient Path, is the chapter I'm most satisfied with. After that, it will be the beginning of the next volume and the beginning of the last volume. This month is the month after the new book month. I've written the most and everyone can see that it's the most exhausting month I've written. At the same time, I think it's the best month I've written. Just like what Mo Wu said in his book, The things you write must be worthy of yourself and everyone else. For the story of the year of Qingyu, I can be worthy of myself, and I think I can be worthy of all the readers who have subscribed and voted for it. This is the reason why I sincerely ask for monthly votes. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.